sixth session of the Senate and the second regular session of the 18th Congress is hereby called to order. Senator Sani Angara will lead the chamber in prayer.
Thank you, Mr. President. Behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is there anything too hard for me? Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 27. Indeed, our Father in heaven, with you nothing in this world is impossible. In thy holy name, nothing is too hard. Sa bawat araw po, Panginoon, patuloy ang aming pagsusumamo na kami ay iyong gabayan, tulungan, at akayin habang kami ay naninibihan bilang mga lingkod bayan. Lalo na po ngayon, nasa gitna pa rin po tayo ng pandemya, atrasado ang ating ekonomiya, at marami ang nahihirapan at humihingi ng saklolo. Mabibigat na issue at sari-saring problema ang aming kinakaharap, subalit sa kabila nito, Panginoon, nanatiling matatag ang aming paniniwala na sa tulong ninyo, maiigpawan namin ang mga hamon na ito. It is through your Spirit that we work each day to find solutions and reforms. It is through your grace that we aim to serve our countrymen well. And it is through your love that we are able to carry this responsibility of public service. Anumang hirap na dinaranas ng bansa at ng buong mundo ngayon, Panginoon, nagtitiwala po kami na ito ay ating malalagpasan sa tamang panahon sa tulong ng inyong mapagpalang palad. Amen.
Amen. Secretary, will please call the roll.
Roll call of members. The Honorable Senators Angara,
Present.
Binay,
Present.
Cayetano,
Present.
De Lima, De La Rosa,
Present.
Drilon,
Present.
Gatchalian, Go, Gordon,
Present.
Ontiveros,
Present.
Lacson, Lapid, Marcos,
Present.
Pacquiao,
Present.
Pangilinan, Pimentel III,
Present.
Poe,
Present.
Recto,
Present.
Revilla Jr.,
Present.
Tolentino, Villanueva, Villar,
Present.
Zubiri.
Present.
Senate President Soto III is present.
With 7 senators physically present and 15 senators virtually present for a total of 22, the chair declares the presence of a quorum. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I move that we defer the reading and approval of the journals to later hours. They're still being prepared, Mr. President. I so move.
You're talking of journal session number what?
They're
44?
44th and 45th, as told to me by my staff. They're still being readied, Mr. President, from the depth
We
set.
have 44 here, but if you have not read it, all right, no objection.
Yes.
The journals deferred.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I move that we proceed with the reference of business.
The Secretary will proceed with the reference of business.
Reference of business, messages from the House of Representatives. Letter from the House of Representatives informing the Senate that on 9 February 2021, it designated Representatives De Jesus, Ong Jr., Ebcas, and Guya as conferees to the Bicameral Conference Committee on the Disagreeing Provisions of House Number 5925, entitled An Act Making the Position of a Cooperatives Officer Mandatory in the Municipal, City, and Provincial levels, amending for the purpose Republic Act Number 7160, otherwise known as the Local Government Code of 1991, and Senate Number 1855, an act making the position of Cooperatives Development Officer mandatory in the municipal, city, and provincial levels, amending for the purpose Republic Act Number 7160, otherwise known as the Local Government Code of 1991, as amended.
Referred to the Committee on Rules.
Letter from the House of Representatives informing the Senate that on 9 February 2021, it designated Representatives Bravo Jr., Tan, Cabuchan III, Bustos, and Bordado Jr. as conferees to the Bicameral Conference Committee on the Disagreeing Provisions of House Number 8261, an act lowering the minimum height requirement and removing the height waiver for applicants to the Philippine National Police, PNP, Bureau of the Fire Protection, BFP, Bureau of Jail Management, Penology, BJMP, and Bureau of Corrections, BUCOR, amending for the purpose Republic Act Number 690 6975 as amended, Republic Act Number 8551, Republic Act Number 9263 as amended, and Republic Act Number 10575, and Senate Number 1563, an act lowering the minimum height requirement for applicants of the Philippine National Police PNP, Bureau of Fire Protection BFP, Bureau of Jail Management and Penology BJMP, and Bureau of Corrections Bucor, amending Republic Act Number 69575 as amended, Republic Act Number 9263, and Republic Act Number 10575, and for other purposes.
Referred to the Committee on Rules.
Bills on first reading, Senate Number 2045, an act imposing amusement tax on digital platform and off-site betting stations of licensed cockpits and earmarking the total amusement tax collection from cockpits for universal health care, amending for this purpose Section 125 and creating a new Section 288-B of the National Internal Revenue Code of 1997 as amended, introduced by Senator Recto.
To the Committee on Ways and Means.
Senate Number 2046, an act exempting the donation of vaccines, critical products, essential goods, equipment, or supplies needed to contain and mitigate COVID-19 from donors' tax and for other purposes, introduced by Senator Angara.
To the Committee on Ways and Means.
Senate Number 2047, an act to rehabilitate Laguna de Bay and to strengthen the Laguna Lake Development Authority, LLDA, repealing for this purpose Republic Act Number 4850 as amended, otherwise known as the Laguna Lake Development Authority Act of 1966, providing funds therefore and for other purposes, introduced by Senator Gordon.
To the Committees on Government Corporations, Environment, Ways and Means, and Finance.
Resolutions, PS Resolution Number 643, resolution expressing the profound sympathy and sincere condolences of the Senate of the Philippines on the death of former Representative and Mayor James Bong Gordon Jr., introduced by Senator Zubiri.
To the Committee on Rules.
PS Resolution Number 644, resolution directing the proper Senate committees to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the reported illegal online adoption facilitated through fake Facebook accounts, introduced by Senator Binay.
To the Committees on Women and Social Justice.
Communication, letter from the Office of the President of the Philippines transmitting to the Senate two original copies of Republic Act Number 11522 entitled An Act Declaring May 18 of every year as the National Higher Education Day, which was signed by President Rodrigo Roa Duterte.
To the Archives. Majority Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, with the permission of the body, I move that we consider proposed Senate Resolution Number 643, taking in consideration proposed Senate Resolution Number 646. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Chair hears none. Consideration is in order. 643.
May we ask the Secretary, Mr. President, to read the title of the measure?
Secretary will read the title of the measure without prejudice into inserting into the records the text of the said resolution.
Resolution expressing the profound sympathy and sincere condolences of the Senate of the Philippines on the death of former Representative and Mayor James Bong Gordon Jr.
Mr. President,
Leader.
may I be allowed to sponsor the said resolution, Mr. President?
Yes, by all means. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to honor the life of former Zambales Congressman and Olongapo Mayor James Bong Gordon Jr., who sadly passed away yesterday at the age of 3 years old. He was a natural leader who learned the ropes from his family and family of public servants, particularly his parents, Mayor James L. Gordon and Mayor Amelia J. Gordon, and his older brother and our very dear friend, Senator Richard J. Gordon. He served as a representative of the 1st District of Zambales from 1995 to 2004, before serving as a 3-term mayor of the great city of Olongapo from 2004 to 2013, ably maintaining the Gordon legacy of urban management and top-notch peace and order ratings for the city. He also dedicated himself, Mr. President, to disaster response, prioritizing Olongapo City's disaster preparedness, response, and recovery practices, and to guard against many calamities that threatened the hazard-prone city. His passing, Mr. President, is a great loss for Olongapo City and the country. I will always fondly remember him as Kong Bong, my classmate in Congress in 1998 all the way to 2004, He was such a kind man who had such a talent and infectious passion for music. We used to gather together and to sing songs, and he created the group called House Boys, and I was one of the members of that group, House Boys. It's a singing group that he formed in Congress. We'd spend hours practicing and singing Beatles songs with Congressman Bong. And he also had a band called the Bongo Band. Wala pa si Senator Bongo, meron na pong Bongo Band as early as then. And I remember that every time we had a fellowship with other congressmen, fellowship with other dignitaries, he would bring out his guitar, and in his car, his driver was actually one of his band members, and he would just play music for free to all of us. He was such a lovely spirit, Mr. President, such a happy spirit, and he will be missed terribly. Our deepest condolences go out to his wife, former Zambales Vice Governor Anne Marie Gordon, his daughter Amelia Jane, and of course to our dear friend and colleague, Senator Richard Gordon. Mr. President, maraming salamat po. And if I may make a motion already, Mr. President, an omnibus motion, if we can make all members of the Senate as a sponsor and author of this measure, Mr. President.
Yes, Senator Villanueva?
Yes, I joined the motion, Mr. President, of the Majority Leader that all members be made co-author. And if I may, Mr. President, just make a short manifestation. I was with Congressman Bong Gordon for quite some time in the House of Representatives, together with a lot of our colleagues here, with Senator Win Gatchalian, with Senator Amy Marcos, Senator I think Sani Angara and others. I just recall, Mr. President, during that time when we were voting on the Dual Citizenship Act, and the members of the opposition were saying that we can never do that because hindi daw po pwedeng mamangka sa dalawang ilog, etc. But during that explanation of vote, Congressman James Bong Gordon explained his vote by saying, I vote yes dahil gusto kong mamangka sa dalawang ilog, and that elicit laughter inside the session hall. Congressman Bong Gordon is a very nice and amiable gentleman. He served his people with integrity and competence. We will miss him, and we pray for the family of the Gordon family, Tito Dick, Tita Kate, and the rest of the family. And we join again the speech of the gentleman from Bukidnon, Senator Mig Subiri. Maraming salamat, Ginoong Pangulo.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, with that, I move that we adopt Senate Resolution number 643, taking consideration 646, with all members of the Senate as authors and co-authors. I so move, Mr. President.
As co-authors and co-sponsors. All right.
Yes.
Any objection? Chair hears none. With deepest condolences to Senator Richard Gordon, Senate approves PS Resolution 643, taking into consideration PS Resolution 646.
Maraming salamat po, Mr. President. And once again, our deepest condolences, Ninong Dick, our deepest condolences po sa inyo.
Our condolences.
May we recognize Senator Gordon, Mr. President.
Senator Richard Gordon is recognized.
I would just like to thank everybody, especially Mix and Senator Villanueva and all of you, my friends, for remembering my brother. Thank you. Thank you very much. My family. Thank you.
Yes, you're most welcome, and our condolences again, Senator Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, we have some items on our agenda. Mr. President, I move that we resume consideration. We have on the agenda two bills, one bill for approval on second reading. If we are ready, we can take that up now. Senator Ara, Senator Ralph Recto, have you gotten a copy of the cleared version of the amendments? I think you'd asked if you wanted
Sent
your
electronically.
copy.
It was, yes, it was sent electronically to all the members of the Senate. Majority Leader, I was informed by the Secretariat.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator, yes.
Everything,
What is-
we'd just like to ask you to, Senator Recto had asked me to send him also a copy of it. If everything in order, Senator, can we already tackle this for
Yes,
second reading?
Yes, I have no questions, Majority Leader. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, with that, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill number 1955.
Any objection? Chair hears none. Consideration of Senate 1955 is in order.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that we close. Did we close the period of amendments yesterday, Mr. President? I don't recall.
Yes, we did. We did.
Okay, Mr. President. Therefore, I move to approve on second reading Senate Bill number 1955. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Chair hears none. Senate Bill 1955 is here approved on second reading.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, move to suspend consideration of the measure.
Consideration of the measure is suspended.
Mr. President, we have another item on the agenda. These are the learners with disabilities. I know a few of our colleagues would still like to interpolate and ask questions. I move that we resume consideration of Senate Bill number 1907. I so move.
Any objection? Hearing none, consideration of 1907 is in order.
May we recognize the sponsor, Mr. President, Senator Sherwin Gatchalian, and to interpolate, I believe it was Senator, yesterday, the one online were Senator Risa and Senator Joel Villanueva.
Mr. President, I will no longer interpolate. I just reiterate my support for the bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
All right, Senator
Therefore,
Ontiveros
Mr.
no
President.
longer interpolating. We recognize now the sponsor, Senator Sherwin Gatchalian, and to interpolate, Senator Joel Villanueva.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, distinguished Majority Floor Leader. Will the distinguished gentleman from Valenzuela, my seatmate, yield to some questions from this representation?
More than willingly, Mr. President, especially from my kababayan and my seatmate and longtime colleague from since the 12th Congress.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the onset, please allow me to thank the good sponsor for really working hard for this particular measure. I remember Senator Gatchalian presided I think 10 marathon hearings, including the technical working group on this measure from July to August of 2020. And although we already have a number of laws espousing inclusion in schools, it is undeniable, Mr. President, that that a systematic framework to support the implementation of inclusive education is necessary to sustain these programs. This representation, distinguished colleague, is aware of the reasons why the committee chose learners with disabilities in the title instead of learners with special needs. But to put into the record, Mr. President, can we get an explanation from the good sponsor in choosing learners with disabilities instead of I would say, more encompassing terms like learners with special needs or learners with exceptionalities?
Thank you, Mr. President, for that clarificatory question. And indeed, in the beginning, when we were discussing this bill with the Department of Education, and in fact, the initial concept of this bill is inclusive education, espousing all types of learners. But after the hearings and technical working groups, we came to the conclusion that different sectors will have different needs. No? For example, the indigenous peoples, the learners of indigenous peoples will have different needs. Learners of the madrasa program will have different needs. Even the gifted children will have different needs, Mr. President. So we narrowed it down to learners with disabilities to really give a lot of focus and to put a lot of detail in the law on how to support our learners with disabilities moving towards inclusive education, Mr. President. So yes, the simple answer there, Mr. President, is we want to focus on our learners with disabilities.
So it is really focused on just learners with disabilities, Mr. President, because it is only a subset or of learners with special needs, but a bigger umbrella where all these concepts would fall is inclusive education, as the good sponsor already mentioned. And just to put on record, learners with special needs would include students involved in armed conflict or
Correct, Mr. President.
indigenous people. But Mr. President, let me just put also on record that there's a DOH administrative order number 2013-005 dated February 7 of 2019, and there are 9 disabilities: deaf, visual disability, intellectual disability, learning disability, mental disability, orthopedic disability, physical disability, psychosocial disability, and speech and language impairment. These are all included, Mr. President, distinguished colleague, when
Yes,
you talk
Mr.
about learners with disability program.
You're absolutely correct, Mr. President. Those you enumerated will fall under learners with disabilities. And in fact, the DepEd itself has a comprehensive list of disabilities. Some are they considered can be detected through physical manifestation. Some needs a lot of intervention and assessment before they officially declare a learner has disability, Mr. President.
Perhaps another reason why we choose learners with disabilities, because the Department of Education, distinguished colleague, uh, members of this institution, has no data on learners with disabilities who are in the mainstream or inclusive classrooms. Is that correct, Mr. President?
Unfortunately, yes, Mr. President. Not only lack of data, but also a proactive approach to look for our learners with disabilities. Right now, as we speak, there are about 360,000 learners with disabilities enrolled in our school system. But there's an estimate from UNICEF, but this estimate, I take it with a lot of caveats, that the learners with disabilities in our country is about 5 million. No? Nevertheless, it's admitted, DepEd admitted in our hearings that there is a program they call the Child Find Program, no? In which DepEd is called upon to proactively look for learners with disabilities. And this program is not being activated. Therefore, the 360,000 is truly an underestimate of the true picture of our learners with disabilities, because a lot of our parents don't bring their children to school. A lot of our parents don't know where to go. And if there is no proactive mechanism, then a lot of our parents with learners with disabilities will just leave their children at home, and don't know where to go in order to get education, Mr. President.
Thank you for that, distinguished colleague. I can relate to the statements being mentioned by our distinguished chair of the Committee on Basic Education. Let me go to another point on Section 21 of the committee report. It states that all cities and municipalities shall establish a help desk in every barangay, which shall function as the focal unit in the barangay to assist learners with disabilities, their parents or guardians, caregivers, and other family members on matters affecting the education and provision of services and programs to learners with disabilities. Just to clarify, Mr. President, distinguished colleague, will this barangay help desk play a role in the preliminary assessment of the condition and needs of children with disabilities or suspected disabilities?
Thank you for that question, Mr. President. And this was extensively discussed in the 10 TEWGs that we conducted. And reason for this, Mr. Chair, Mr. President, in some remote areas, the barangay is the only contact point of families. And there are cases that families will need vehicles, will need assistance, and will need other support assistance. And the barangay is the only focal government agency there. So the resource persons um, wanted this in the bill so that it will prompt the barangay to assist learners with disabilities in their needs, especially going to school or attending classes. However, we made sure that it's also in line with RA 7277 or the Persons with Disabilities Act. And in that law, a Persons with Disability Office was already created so that we won't duplicate the functions of that. We made sure that the help desk will be in coordination with the Persons with Disability Office all the time. So it's
Yeah.
not a separate barangay desk, but an arm of that Person with Disability Office, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President. May we be enlightened as to how it's going to be different with barangay health workers, with this barangay health desk, no? And perhaps if you could give us a bird's eye view of what kind of role would they be playing in the, for example, in the which I believe is very important, the preliminary assessment of children with disabilities or suspected disabilities.
Mr. President, how we envision to operationalize this is, for example, in a remote area, the barangay is the only contact government agency there, and a child needs to be transported because, for example, he's handicapped or he needs special assistance. The barangay, through its help desk, will be the one activated to assist that learner with disability. And since barangay is scattered all over the country, the help desk will become the focal desk for learners with disabilities needing assistance. So there'll be a point person as opposed to just a random barangay employee, but there will be a focal person there that families can tap and can call, and they know that this help desk is empowered to support them.
Would there be any general qualification perhaps or training required of this barangay help desk, Mr. President?
That's a very good question, Mr. President. It will be very helpful if the person in charge in the help desk understands the needs of learners with disabilities and understands how to approach this and how to give the necessary assistance to our learners with disabilities. But you're absolutely correct that it's not only important appointing the help desk, but also a knowledgeable person, and a person that who appreciates the complexities in helping learners with disabilities.
Thank you, Mr. President. And just for the record, this representation would like to help in any way he can. And we just wanted to put this on record to make sure that we will have a significant measure that we can all be proud of. Just to continue, Mr. President, what role, if any, would this barangay help desk play, for example, in the child find system, as you made mention a while ago? And if you look at the status or the situation right now of our country, where a lot of children with disabilities or children who are in need are not being discovered, Mr. President. Would this be part of the role, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President. In the law, it will be in some in coordination with Sorry, Mr. President. I'm just looking for the exact language in the bill. But what's envisioned in the bill, Mr. President, insofar as the child fine system, DepEd will coordinate with the local government unit. And since the barangay is an arm of the local government unit, the barangay will also play a very important role in the child fine system. The child fine system, Mr. President, is a system embedded in the law so that the local schools and the local DepEd will be proactive in looking for learners with disabilities. Just to share the body, my experience, a lot of parents are afraid, and a lot of parents have already lost hope in sending their children to school. And we need to look for them. We need to find them and explain to them that there is hope and there is a system, an education system that they can tap into in order to help their children gain knowledge, help their children be included in society, and give hope, especially give hope to our parents, Mr. President.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. President. Distinguished colleague, you made mention about RA 7277 and RA 10070, no? Itong Persons with Disability Affairs Office. Because under this measure, the Barangay Help Desk shall coordinate with the Persons with Disability Affairs Office established under the two measures that we made mention. But for the record, Mr. President, how many persons with Disability Affairs Office do we have in the country at present?
Mr. President, it's created by law, and I would assume that all LGUs have a Persons with Disabilities Office, Mr. President.
Well, I think that is the ideal, Mr. President. I have here with me a report from the Asia Foundation, and according to them, only 6 out of 10 LGUs, Mr. President, have a person with the Disability Affairs Office. This means, Mr. President, that there are no adequate higher offices which this Barangay Help Desk could coordinate with once this law is enacted. So I just want to put that on record, and I joined the distinguished lady from Taguig yesterday when she made mention about this particular measure, that we are one with it. We are united in passing a measure like this. In fact, I laud the efforts of our good chair for being so passionate in passing this measure, but we also don't want to create false hopes. And I think this particular matter would also be important to tackle in this deliberation, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President, upon checking the PDAO law, it's mandated that all
Yes.
provinces and LGUs, municipalities and cities should have PDAO offices, Mr. President.
Yes, but unfortunately, it is not the case right now,
Correct,
Mr. President. And my only point, Mr. President, is that you look at the number of learners with disabilities struggling in school. It is just the tip of the iceberg, Mr. President. I think more children are left behind as they are not captured in the educational system. For instance, Mr. President, you look at PhilHealth records. PhilHealth estimates that 1 out of every 7 Filipino children is living with disabilities. This is equivalent, Mr. President, to 5.1 million Filipino children. 5.1 million Filipino children. And of that total, DepEd estimates that only 1.4% or 71,000 non-graded learners were enrolled for the upcoming school year as of September 2020. So again, Mr. President, there's no question that strengthening the services in the local level is crucial, and I am one with the sponsor in strengthening and empowering our local government units in order to serve our persons, our children with disabilities or special needs, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. And you're absolutely correct that 5 million came out in a paper by UNICEF, Mr. President. And in fact, even PSA, in their estimate, there are about 457,000 learners with disabilities. And that's almost 100,000 less on the number of learners with disabilities enrolled in our schools. And definitely far cry from the 5 million estimated by UNICEF and the organization that you mentioned, Mr. President. That's why we need to be proactive. A lot of this stems from an experience of mine, Mr. President, when I was a local chief executive. A lot of our parents already lost hope in educating their children, and some don't know where to go, Mr. President. And that's why we need to be proactive. In fact, that was a subject matter during the hearing, how government is implementing a proactive approach in looking for learners with disabilities and encouraging parents and also empowering them in making sure that their children will have a good future, Mr. President.
Thank you for that, Mr. President, and I agree that this measure is a good start, and that is why it is also important to pinpoint some of the provisions that perhaps we can improve on, and
Yes,
at
Mr.
least
President.
at this level, Mr. President, we can already settle that this is really our main goal here, no, Mr. President. For example, Mr. President, let me talk about the inclusive learning resource centers. According to DILG, there are right now 1,634 cities and municipalities in the Philippines. So there are 1,488 municipalities and 146 cities. Now, in contrast, Mr. President, you look at the data of the Department of Education as of 2019, it shows that there are only 648 SPED centers. So, Mr. President, this means that roughly you need 1,000 ILRCs that will have to be established or opened from scratch or from the ground, while the SPED centers will be converted into inclusive learning resource centers under the measure. So, Mr. President, if that is the case, how are we looking at this? Will there be some sort of timeline? I think this was discussed yesterday by Senator Pia, as to the timeline of as to how many perhaps ILRCs are we looking at? I remember when we were discussing the Doktor Para sa Bayan measure, and we were looking at the number of scholars at present, we had this target in a year's time, we would actually double the target of doctor scholars.
Yes.
Is there anything like that, Mr. President, distinguished colleague?
Mr. President, we didn't put a specific timeline as well as specific number in terms of specialists that needs to be hired. And this is precisely because of the lack of data and information coming from DepEd. It's very difficult to put down a definite number without definite information. So that the modality that we went through is to come up with a roadmap, an assessment, a roadmap, and a clear timetable as well as budgetary necessities
Yes.
in order to launch this law, Mr. President. Admittedly, they need to conduct massive surveys, Mr. President, to know the real score on the ground. And after getting the full picture, that's a time DepEd can recommend how many specialists they will need, where are the learning resource centers that they should put up, and what type of services that they will be launching in that area, Mr. President.
Thank you, distinguished colleague. And let me also put on record that while we are talking about the 1,634 municipalities and the cities in the country, we're not even talking about the barangays here, Mr. President. We are all aware that, for example, in my town, in my hometown, Bukawi, there are about 19 barangays, and some of our barangays are really hard to reach, Mr. President. No, so yung access is also a concern. Having 42,000 46 barangays in our country. Now, Mr. President, is it envisioned also in this bill, as mentioned a while ago by our distinguished sponsor, that we wanted to provide the learners with mobility, disability, for example, wheelchairs, so they can go from schools? Is it envisioned also in the bill that the ILRC will somehow be able to provide blind students with braille translated textbooks, enough for all? I don't know if this would be enough for all the blind learners, Mr. President, but this is part of the vision, right, Mr.
Yes,
President?
yes.
Or will it be borrowed, or will it be borrowed only when needed basis, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President. We didn't put hard and fast details in the bill, Mr. President, to give flexibility to the learning resource centers, to give flexibilities to our teachers. However, Mr. President, it's written in the law that this type of assistance and intervention will be given. Even equipment will be given either directly to the families of the learner with disabilities or the learning resource center, wherein they can go there and access all of this equipment. They can share the equipment with other learners, Mr. President.
Indeed, Mr. President, this is not an easy measure to achieve our goals and targets, but it's good to note that we are starting now, and we are doing our best to address this very challenging situation that we are in, Mr. President. Let me go to another topic on human resources requirements, Mr. President, which I think is very vital. And let me not talk about the human resources requirement for the entire ILRC, Mr. President. Let me just talk about the human resources requirement needed for assessment, which I personally believe is very important, Mr. President. Having experience this or in this particular situation, Mr. President. Mr. President, our question is, what is the estimated total human resource requirement of ILRCs that would be directly involved in assessment and diagnosis of learners with disabilities? Specifically, Mr. President, their development domains and areas of concerns.
Mr. President, going by our experience in Valenzuela, and I want to thank and put on record our point person there, Ms. Tess Pangan, who have been passionately implementing our inclusive education in support of learners with disabilities. In fact, she was so passionate that all of her children took special needs education in college. Mr. President, based on our experience in Valenzuela, one learning resource center will need one supervisor, four SPED teacher, one guidance counselor, one developmental pediatrician, one physical therapist, one occupational therapist, and one speech language pathologist, Mr. President. So those are the basic specialists that our learning resource centers will require, Mr. President.
5, 6, 7, 8. You're talking about like 10, no, Mr. President? No?
Yes, around 10, Mr.
Yeah,
President.
around 10 to have a team, and that is perhaps an ideal, Mr. President. And I'm not sure if we can say that it is perhaps the minimum standards that we will set. But anyway, before going there, Mr. President, and let me just continue the questions that I'm raising, Mr. President. What system will be adopted by the ILRC to refer learners with disabilities to medical facilities for complementary or more advanced assessment? Hindi naman ho, syempre lahat, when we assess, hindi lahat nandun sa average o dun sa isang category, no? Some would need medical attention. Some would probably need a more advanced assessment. Is there a system for that, Mr. President?
Yes. Mr. President, before I answer that, Mr. President, the specialists that I mentioned earlier, 10 specialists, this is a minimum requirement. No? But from our experience, there'll be a lot of aides, there'll be a lot of assistants. In fact, I remember every time I go to our, we call it SPED Center for now, no? But that's the equivalent of a learning resource center. There are more aides who have been trained to implement the individualized education plan because specialists are very hard to come by. We trained aides to implement the IEPs, no, to our learners with disabilities. So in regards to the referral, Mr. President, depending on the assessment of the child, definitely the Learning Resource Center can refer the child to other medical facilities for other intervention, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Again, just to put on record, assessment is very crucial
Correct, Mr.
because
President.
referral and intervention for learners with disabilities are not possible, Mr. President, without that. And I thank
Correct, Mr.
the
President.
distinguished gentleman for emphasizing that, Mr. President. Now, when you made mention, Mr. President, about the minimum requirement, I come across the provision here under the committee report that the ILRC has the function to provide access to language and speech therapy, OT, physical and psychotherapy, among other modes of treatment through a multidisciplinary system. Now, a multidisciplinary system, multidisciplinary team, I mean, shall be composed of any or all of the following. I'm just a little concerned about the word of any or all of the following. So, yung educational psychologist, guidance counselor, neurological psychiatrist, physical therapist, etc. And so on, no? Hanggang dun sa ILRC supervisor. Mr. President, any or all. Pero kanina, we both agreed, no? Na bagamat napaka-challenging, the minimum requirement, Mr. President, as made mention by our distinguished colleague, is at least 10. So perhaps, just to put on record, what is the envisioned minimum composition of the multidisciplinary team in the ILRCs? Is this different from what we were talking about kanina, Mr. President?
Yeah, Mr. President, we gave the Learning Resource Center the flexibility to come up with their own multidisciplinary team. And in consultation with the other resource persons, different jurisdictions might have different requirements, Mr. President. So to give them the flexibility to customize the specialists that they need, we gave them the flexibility in the law to hire this type of specialist, Mr. President. So
Yes.
depending on the situation, Mr. President. on
Yes,
the
I
ground.
agree, Mr. President. And again, ideally, we can have more, but should we identify perhaps a minimum composition, Mr. President, of this multidisciplinary team?
Mr. President, my initial thoughts is because different areas will have probably different disabilities or learners with disabilities and will have different situations.
I can understand, Mr.
Yeah,
President.
so it's very difficult
I
to
can understand.
already itemize in the law the minimums, Mr.
Because
President.
unfortunately, even as we speak right now and debate on this, we don't have the data.
Correct.
Mr.
It's very
President.
difficult to.
Yes.
In fact, we don't have the data. And we don't have the exact
Yes.
scenario
It's
on
just
the
that
ground.
I'm not comfortable with any or all. I mean, anyway, Mr. President, we'll look into it when at the proper time, perhaps in the period of amendments, we will come up with something like that. But just the same, I agree with the distinguished sponsor. Now, Mr. President, Section 8, letter C of the bill also states that mobile teachers shall be hired, and I saw this word, whenever necessary. May we clarify with the sponsor what constitutes necessary? Because, you know, in my experience as a 9-year member of the House and for quite some time here in the Senate, when you put the word whenever necessary. Madalas, Mr. President, nakakaligtaan na yan eh, no? So, and in a lot of areas, Mr. President, where this human resource are needed, eh, hindi ho talaga nila mapuntahan, hindi nila ma-access, eh, kasi nga ho, wala naman talagang taong po pwedeng pumunta ho doon, no? Multitasking ho sila. So, may we know, Mr. President, again, what constitutes necessary whenever necessary, Mr. President?
Mr. President, when we were discussing this with the resource persons, Mr. President, who are primarily composed of different organizations from different disabilities, Mr. President, some areas, for example, far-flung areas or the GIDA areas, Mr. President, the learner with disability will really have problems going to school on a regular basis. So this provision authorizes the DepEd to hire mobile teachers, and the mobile teachers are envisioned to go to the far-flung areas, go to areas where learners with disabilities are located, but services are not available. So it gives DepEd the flexibility to hire teachers that can go out, that can reach out, that can physically reach the learners with disabilities in far-flung remote areas, Mr. President.
I agree, Mr. President, and I also believe it is best to specify the conditions which warrant the hiring of mobile teachers to assist in isolated or remote schools to make the law clearer to implement na ikaw, na-hire ka, ikaw, pang remote area ka talaga.
Yeah.
Yun na talaga yung ano mo, no, hindi yung kung meron lang available na po pwedeng pumunta doon sa remote area, that's the only time. So I hope,
Yes.
and at the proper time, I hope
Yes.
we will be allowed to make some or introduce some amendments, Mr.
Mr.
President.
President, we welcome any suggestion, any language that will improve the bill. Definitely, this is a work in progress, and I really appreciate from the good gentleman from Bukawe I would really appreciate his solutions and his suggestions to further sharpen the bill, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm almost done, Mr. President. It's just that I also wanted to talk about the long-term human resources strategy because in connection, the bill provides that the Department of Education shall coordinate with the OH and DSWD for the hiring of the necessary personnel and support staff, including qualified persons with disabilities to operate, administer, and oversee the ILRC. May we know, distinguished colleague, what is the target human resource requirement of all the ILRCs to be established and converted nationwide? What is the key strategy to meet this number, Mr. President? Or we leave it to the establishment of the roadmap, Mr. President?
Mr. President, we have some estimates written here. However, in the absence of on-the-ground data, Mr. President, there's a lot of caveats, and I'm not very comfortable in sharing that number, Mr. President. We have a lot of tabletop computations, Mr. President, but without that on-the-ground data, it's very difficult to pinpoint with accuracy what type of specialists, what type of manpower do we need. Well, the basic, Mr. President, is we will have learning resource centers in all LGUs, Mr. President, staffed with competent people and specialists that are important and that they require in their own locality, Mr. President. But this number that I have a lot of caveats.
I can
And
understand.
it's very difficult to use this as a basis, Mr. President. That's why in the bill, Mr. President, the way forward here is to come up with that roadmap. You know? And the process of coming out with that roadmap is a on-the-ground analysis, on-the-ground survey, child find system to look for the learners with disabilities. With those information in place, we can now craft a multi-year roadmap. And the multi-year roadmap, Mr. President, will include also the budgetary requirements.
Yes.
The bill
This
will
is more
not
challenging, Mr. President.
correct. The bill will not um, instantly hire specialists and build ILRCs overnight. It's not going to
Yes.
do that, Mr. President. But what it will do is already start the process of coming up with a feasible roadmap that will enable DepEd reach out and accommodate our learners with disabilities in a inclusive education setting, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I'm wondering, and uh, for curiosity's sake, Mr. President, um, can you base the data from DepEd? The public education sector only has, I think, 3,000 to 4,000 SPED teachers. Is that correct, Mr. President? What would be the ideal number, Mr. President?
To be exact, Mr. President, it's 4,268, Mr. President.
4,268
68.
SPED teachers.
Yes.
But Mr. President, what would be the ideal number?
The ideal number should be 45,000, Mr. President, based on current enrollment,
Wow.
Mr. President.
The ideal number is 45,000 and we only have 4,268. Now, Mr.
Correct.
President, under the DepEd, in collaboration with CHED, they shall develop a scholarship program for in-service teachers who shall take courses or required units on special needs or inclusive education. May we know, distinguished colleague, how many scholars are we targeting? And perhaps if you could give us a bird's eye view on how we'll be able to reach this 45,000 SPED teachers, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I read the research of Dr. Bustos from UP School of Education, and she is the specialist in charge of special needs education. And in her research, Mr. President, a lot of our in-service teachers, meaning teachers already teaching, want to further increase their knowledge in terms of inclusive education and further improve their skills in
Yeah.
terms of handling and in terms of accommodating learners with disabilities. However, the incentives are not there, no? And the bill now will incentivize in-service teacher to further improve their skills, to further improve their confidence in terms of implementing inclusive education in their respective schools, and to further improve their skills in accommodating learners with disabilities in their general education classroom, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I was just trying to help out and perhaps have this assurance that we'll be able to somehow, for example, double the number of scholars, etc. But I will leave it to the chair, Mr. President, and since inclusion is the goal, these learners with disabilities will be integrated into regular classes. This bill mentioned about teacher aides. I think we discussed this yesterday during the debate on this particular measure. Will the government employ these teacher aides or shadow teachers and be compensated, or will it be on a volunteer basis, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President. The bill calls for the hiring of teacher aides, Mr. President, and also in the technical working groups that we conducted, this is highly recommended, Mr. President. And
Yes.
it's recommended because teacher aides will now will be the de facto assistant of the general education teachers, and the general education teachers will have more time in crafting the necessary modification and adjustment to enable her to implement inclusive education, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. No, I just thought, Mr. President, that even though we don't put it in the bill itself, at least with this discussion, we'll be able to point out or have some specific targets as to how many SPED teachers, how many teacher aides we are targeting, so that we'll be able to help also
Yes, Mr.
yung pagbuo po ng roadmap, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President.
Thank you. Mr. President, last but not the least, I personally believe on the importance of training and
Yes.
parent education, engagement of the
Education.
family and the loved ones. Now, Mr. President, how will ILRCs provide and facilitate, for example, counseling and training to parents, caregivers, guardians, or other family members on the education of learners with disabilities?
Yes, Mr. President, in the bill, and you're absolutely correct, Mr. President, in the bill, um, there'll be trainings and orientations, even counseling programs for family members, Mr. President. And family members, especially parents, will play a very big role, Mr. President, in the implementation of this bill. And that's why we, in the bill, we specify the trainings that should be given to our parents and guardians, Mr. President.
Yes, I encountered this section 24. Under section 24, the DepEd, the PIA shall conduct an intensified nationwide information dissemination campaign on the rights of learners with disabilities under this act and other existing laws, which shall include the prevention, early identification, assessment of a disabling condition, and a strategic intervention programs for learners and disabilities. I just hope, Mr. President, that we can highlight this in such a way that we can really bombard the different agencies, implementing agencies, to really do this. Now, another thing, Mr. President, is perhaps the importance of coming up with modules. Because as a parent, Mr. President, when a parent is so busy in his or her daily work, when he comes home and he or she would have this spare time, meron pong module na available, Mr. President. I think one of the objectives of the bill is to provide the parents or guardians with the information and opportunities to actively participate in the possible placement options and educational programs for learners with disabilities to enable them to make informed choices and decisions. Another question, for my last question, Mr. President, to our distinguished colleague, how do we assess whether the ILRCs are doing well or they are providing adequate access to auxiliary aids and non-educational services as stated in the law? Do we have some sort of, for example, monitoring mechanisms, Mr. President? If we have that, will there be such a mechanism in place to ensure that they're actually working, Mr. President?
Yes. Mr. President, I just want to, with the indulgence of the good gentleman from Bukawi, I just want to go back to the family members
Yes.
and parents training. In section 18, Mr. President, there's a section there that will underscore the importance of trainings and orientation, even counseling programs for family members and guardians. And again, during the technical working group, this was given a lot of attention because we agree with our resource persons that parents and guardians will play a very big role in educating learners with disabilities. And in section 7, letter F, the ILRC are also empowered to train parents and guardians on the same matter, Mr. President, empowerment and also added knowledge on inclusive education, Mr. President. As to the review of the learning resource centers, Mr. President, on section 28 is a mandatory review, impact assessment, and submission of report to Congress. And this is given full information on how the law is being
How they're
implemented
monitoring this
and how and what is the performance of the ILRC and the law as a whole, Mr.
Mr.
President.
President, how will parents be involved in such monitoring mechanism? Are they part of it? Are they part of monitoring this ILRCs? Perhaps to help our distinguished colleague, what we're looking at is parang yung grievance mechanism na from the parents side on how can they monitor these ILRCs, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President, on Section 23, there is a section on procedural safeguards, Mr. President, and to make sure that in the implementation of the law, fairness will be the principle of this law, Mr. President. And that's why there's a procedural safeguard, Mr. President. And this safeguard enables the parents to report to DepEd any issues regarding the implementation of the law. And we even put a time frame so that DepEd will, within the time frame, DepEd will already resolve that grievance or that issue being raised by our parents, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I would support the regular submission than the mandatory na madalas, Mr. President, medyo
Yes.
matagal, Mr. President.
Correct, Mr. President.
No, so I hope that we can do something about it. Again, Mr. President, as a parent, in my own experience, I think parents, guardians, and other family members of learners with disabilities are a crucial part of the whole of community approach towards our goal of having inclusive education. Again, I would like to congratulate and thank my distinguished colleague, the chairperson of the Committee on Basic Education. It's such a great honor and privilege to be part of this measure. And again, I'm looking forward to passing this particular measure, and as it becomes a law, would be able to help our next generation, Mr. President. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the good gentleman from Bukawi for being one of the 11 authors of this inclusive education law, and it shows his commitment and passion also to help our learners with disabilities achieve the rightful education that they deserve, Mr. President. And I would welcome his suggestion. I know that he has a lot of experience, personal experience, as well as personal knowledge in this type of proposals, Mr. President, and we would welcome any suggestion on improving the law, Mr. President. Thank you.
Senator Pia Cayetano wants the floor. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I took the floor already yesterday, but I just like to summarize for His Honor my concerns or the priority concerns so that we can be more expeditious when we enter the period of amendments, if that is okay with His Honor.
Yes, Mr. President.
Thank you. And this is also because I had discussions before Senator Joel took the floor, and then Senator Francis also and I talked about it. So I'm happy that there are many of our colleagues who are interested in further improving this measure. So I'd just like to reiterate, and I heard Senator Joel say it, and again, Senator Francis mentioned to me that i-emphasize natin yung timeline sana for the implementation. And my concern here is very simple. When we pass this, and God willing, pwede na pumasok yung mga bata, I don't know if that's by June or next June, I don't know when. I don't want there to be confusion or misunderstanding on the parts of parents that the school in their locality will automatically be required to provide and be able to provide for their students. We have to be very conscious of what can transpire, how effective we can implement this within a reasonable amount of time. So in other words, I'm thinking of a public school or even a very small private school, and suddenly they'll say, pumasa na yung batas so tanggapin yung anak ko. Teka, wala pa kaming ganito, wala pa kaming ganon. So I think we need to dissect that a little bit, Your Honor, to ensure that there is no confusion later on. And then we also don't put the agencies in a situation where iba yung intention natin, iba yung intention nila. Iba yung intindi nila. I think we should be very clear about that. Timelines could include how many days are we giving them to come up with that roadmap? Is that 60 days, 90 days, 360 days? I don't know. I don't know how much work His Honor has done. Knowing His Honor, he works so hard. I don't think His Honor knows the difference between day and night. That we all know. So no question on His Honor's ability to get this done. But realistically, how does His Honor assess the ability of the agencies to come up with those timelines for the roadmap? So I think the roadmap itself would already be a good starting point. But having said that, again, and I mentioned it very briefly yesterday, you might want to start with attainable goals, such that what? Within a year's period, at the very least, every province should have 3 centers, spread out in the north, in the south, in the east, in the west, maybe 4, so that mahirap man, pero accessible and medyo maaasahan. Kasi what I'm really scared of is that the parents would be expecting and they get there, and let's say a small private school with 1 classroom each. How would they be able, and maybe they don't even have a total of 200 students. I cannot foresee how they would, and as we know, a lot of them have closed during this time. I cannot see how they can immediately transition to a school that is capable of handling children with learning disabilities. They can, for sure, but not immediately. How do we make that happen? So yun lang po yung timeline. My second point is the level of inclusivity. Again, I went through this, and His Honor and I believe, are in agreement that, based on the personalized learning program that each child would have, that would also dictate what kind of socialization the child would have, what time of class, how much classroom time. We know that. But again, I'm thinking from a very simple perspective. There's a parent. Yung anak niya, alam niyang may disability. Yung anak niya, feel nila na discriminated because, and again, I will use my own child as an example para wala namang magsabing I'm discriminating, because it's my own child. My son had a cleft lip and palate. He never grew up to be able to express himself because he passed away before he turned 1. But if he had grown up, and if he could be able to speak, he would be ngongo. And you all know na pinagtatawanan ng ngongo. Okay? We all grew up with those jokes. So, here's this parent excited na, makakapasok na yung anak ko dito sa eskwela, aalagaan siya, hindi siya aapihin dito, hindi katulad ng mga kakapit-bahay nilang, hindi nakakaintindi dyan. Tapos sabihin, ay sir, ma'am, hindi namin kaya eh. So you know what I mean? Expectations, again. Expectations, kung walang speech therapist doon, kung hindi naka-intervene doon sa batang yon at the early age, minsan high school na. I try to do cleft lip operations. I can spot a cleft lip child in a crowd. And I've tried to do it with older kids like 18 years old. Ang hirap na pala. Kahit operahan mo, hindi mo na mababalik yung speech nila. So my point is, again, expectations and clarity on what level of inclusivity. It's not to discriminate the child, but it is to ensure that the necessary steps are taken so that their shortcomings or their disabilities can be addressed. And again, I will repeat for those who have not heard it, yung best friend nga ng anak ko nung pumunta sa US, and thankfully, alam niyo sa US, it depends on the state that you're in. If you're in a state that prioritize education and the welfare of the child, buho siyan. Dun sa school, na spot right away na meron siyang learning, maybe it's not even a disability, but learning delay. So masama ang loob ng friend ko dahil pinull out yung anak niya, dun nilagay sa special, Pero 1 year later, binalik siya, and then ngayon, he's the state champion in math. So, you know what I mean? We also need to educate the parents, the community na do not be afraid if ilagay yung anak niyo sa special class kasi dun magiging dun yung opportunity niya for the child to shine. So there's just so much work to be done. I'm just really afraid that without clear timelines, and later on, let's be sure that the communication also is included in the responsibility of the agencies. They must communicate what will the expectations be within the year of implementation, within 3 years, within 5 years, because it's really a process, Mr. President, Mr. Sponsor. And final point is human resources. Again, I'm just repeating the points that I raised, but just to really focus on it. Senator Joel Villanueva correctly pointed out that that what we did during the Dr. Para sa Bayan interpellation and amendment, and I believe it was one of my initiatives, klaruhin natin, let's break it down. What exactly do we need? In fact, I know Senator Joel will recall that, in fact, I'm for the increase of the health human resources, not just the doctors, because it's not enough. I know his honor's bill includes the whole range of professional that will support the child. But instead of just saying that these are the professionals, we need to ensure that CHED is also providing the courses, which is exactly what we did in Doctor Para sa Bayan, na ilan ba ang, how do we encourage more doctors to become developmental pediatricians? Ilan ba talaga kailangan natin? Should we say at least one for each province yung target, whether private or public na lang? Di natin mapipilit yun eh. Di natin mapipilit, di ba? Or we can say we can provide scholarships for those who will work in government for the next 10 years. And for that matter, all the other specialized fields. We need to go back to CHED and see if these areas of if these educational programs are available, and if they are also available in those provinces in exactly the same way we did for Dr. Para sa Bayan. Kasi we might say, okay naman ng Metro Manila, there's SPED class, there's special education teaching courses, there's occupational therapy, there's physical therapy. Paano sa Mindanao? Paano sa Visayas? Wala. And the law does not distinguish. No, we want to ensure that all the families have access to this. And I'd like to point out, it will go back also to our salary structure and budget, because from what I know, most of our physical therapists dream of going out of the country, just like the nurses. So paano? I'm not sure, but I think the OTs are even in higher demand, right? They're even harder to get OT. So I'm just saying, and that's what I meant, Your Honor, when I said I don't want to provide false promises. I know in this chamber that is the farthest thing in our mind, but that's why I feel it is very important to clarify what we intend to achieve with the bill, including timelines, so that precisely we can manage the expectations into a reasonable what we manage expectations so that what we produce is exactly what we said we would produce. And I'll end with this note. His Honor is at the front line. Ang sipag mag-hearing, dami nating hearing. I cannot even attend some of His Honor's hearings on education because he knows how many problems we have on the quality of education. And a big percentage of that, the reason for that is also the quality of teacher education. And so now we're going a step further. Education for children with special needs pa. So, I know His Honor understands, no? But the problem gets deeper and deeper, and we have not even been able to solve the quality of education for the average student who doesn't have learning disability. What more for those that have? Having said that, of course, we fully support, and this is an amazing bill, but that's where our interventions come in. And I thank His Honor for his patience in hearing out the concerns that we have presented to him. Thank you.
Thank you, good gentle lady from Taguig. And I do welcome suggestions that will improve the bill and further clarify a lot of the provisions in the bill, especially on timelines and the other details. And I said yesterday the original, the inspiration of this bill actually came from the original bill that Senator Cayetano filed a few Congresses ago. So it would be an honor to receive some of her suggestion to further improve the bill, Mr. President.
Senator Francis Tolentino, you're recognized.
Just a manifestation, Mr. President. I intend to join the sponsor here as a co-author, if he would be willing to include this representation's name. But just a manifestation, Mr. President. I likewise join Senator Cayetano's effort in including the timeline portion, Mr. President. I know the laudable intent of the good sponsor, but I foresee, as Senator Villanueva mentioned a while ago, I foresee a discriminatory, a regulatory measure that will be discriminatory, Mr. President, insofar as areas which are not urbanized, Mr. President. So my point here is that in contextualizing this, for instance, and I think this is germane to the discussion, I would foresee a discrimination on the part of children not being reached by the educational authorities. Like for instance, Mr. President, I foresee now discrimination on the part of health authorities, Mr. President. We've been discussing for the last several months, and this is germane, Mr. President, and I relate this to Senator Cayetano, the vaccination efforts that will be rolled out next week. Nowhere, Mr. President, can we find a project of the DOH, of other authorities that would include children. In fact, they're not part of the vaccination efforts. 5 years old, they're not part. 7 years old, they're not part. 10 years old, they're not part. 11 years old, they're not part of the vaccination. Recently, the IATF allowed the 10-year-olds to go out to visit the malls, but they retracted that authority. So, in the same vein, Mr. President, I would foresee some discriminatory effects if we do not ensure a timeline, a progression, so to speak. So that's my only comment, Mr. President, and I hope the committee chair would be able to refine and upgrade the measure, which is very laudable, Mr. President. That's all, Mr. President. Salamat po.
Mr. President, in response, it's discrimination that is precisely what we want to eliminate through this bill, Mr. President. And discrimination plagues the learner with disability sector, Mr. President. And that's why the aim of this bill is to completely eliminate that. And Mr. President, likewise, I welcome any suggestion from the good gentleman from Tagaytay. I know he was a former mayor. He knows implementation very well. He has extensive programs on education, and I would welcome any of his suggestion to further sharpen the bill, Mr. President. Thank you.
Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. On the onset, Mr. President, before I close the period of interpellation, I would just like to laud the sponsor, Senator Sharon Gatchalian, for his valiant and gallant effort to push forward the needs of children with disabilities. You know, Mr. President, when I was a congressman, I had several experiences in the province, in the countryside. We'd go to puruks and sitios in the middle of nowhere where you hike 2 to 3 hours to reach the particular place. And I'd see children that are actually chained to the poste of the house. I see children locked up in rooms because they were special children, Mr. President. And until now, I have not forgotten the scene in my mind. I have it clearly in my mind, and I was complaining to the barangay captain, and the barangay captain would say, ay, abnormal yan. That's what they would say. Abnormal yan, kaya tinatalian ng mga magulang kasi lumalabas ng bahay, nakahubad, etc., etc. You know, it was just terrible to see that. And I hope with this bill, we can give them an opportunity to learn, a venue to cultivate the desire to educate them, to be able to educate and nurture them, Mr. President. You know, I have a big respect for families of special children. The challenges that they go through, like Senator Pia, Senator Joel, must be really truly immense. And I laud and praise the author for this. It's about time that we come up with a measure that will be able to help our children with disabilities and special needs, Mr. President. With that, I move that we close the
Mr.
period
President,
of. Ah, yes, Mr.
President,
May we recognize your dear colleague,
Senator,
Senator Coco, Mr. President?
yes, Senator Coco Pimentel is recognized.
first of all, I'd like to point out that I used the feature in WebEx on how to raise your hand. We should know this majority leader.
Sorry, maliit yung hand. I can see this is very small. It's a small print. Pasensya na lang.
It's a high-tech way of raising your hand, Mr. President. But thank you for the time. With the permission of the sponsor, if he is not yet tired, if this representation can ask a very basic question so that I will be able to understand the bill better and appreciate it more. Because I'm really supportive of this effort. So with the permission of the sponsor, sir.
Yes, Mr. President, pardon willingly, Mr. President.
Pardon the basic quality of the questions, Mrs. Sponsor. The purpose of the measure, sir, is to establish these inclusive learning resource centers in all LGUs at the level of city and municipality. Is that the ultimate goal?
Not only that, Mr. President, the ultimate goal is to promote inclusive education in our country, Mr. President. And inclusive education is where the learner with disabilities will be included in general education, Mr. President. But as we all know, we have to implement certain intervention and support services to enable the learner to participate in general education. So, Mr. President, the Learning Resource Center is a tool or one of the tools that will be used in order to achieve that inclusion in general education, and the learning resource centers will have the necessary specialists, the necessary equipment, as
Yes.
well as trainings for our teachers and as well as parents, Mr. President. So this is only one of the tools that will be used in order for the learner with disability to participate fully in general education, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President. But this measure is precisely about that. What do you call them, sir? ILRC or LRC?
ILRC, Mr. President.
ILRC. So this bill is focusing on the establishment of the ILRC. But are these meant to be the transition of the learner with disability for him to now join the general student population, or is the ILRC now going to be the school of the learner with disability?
Mr. President, it really depends on the assessment of the learner with disability. In some cases, the learner with disabilities will spend more time in the ILRC, depending on what type of intervention the learner with disability will need. But the direction is to help the learner gain enough skills to be included in general education, Mr. President. So there'll be specialists, for example, in the case of Valenzuela, we have speech therapists there that guides the learner with disability, and the learner will attend, for example, a session every day until the learner will improve his speech capability to enable him to participate in general education, Mr. President. So it really depends on the assessment of the learner, Mr. President.
So, Mr. President, so can a learner with disability who enrolls in the ILRC possibly spend his entire school age years in the ILRC, and will the ILRC system grant or give this student diploma or certificates which he can use in the future?
That is a possibility, Mr. President. And again, drawing from our experience in Valenzuela, because we took the initiative to practice inclusive education there. There are cases where the student will spend almost 90 to even 100% of his time in the uh, learning resource center, Mr. President. Um, the assessment is a very critical process, Mr. President. And the assessment will also dictate what type of intervention, what type of improvements that we need to see from the child in order for the child to participate fully in general education, Mr. President. Mr. President, with your kind indulgence, I just want to show pictures of our special education center, Mr. President, in page 20. I just want to show everyone, the body, what we have. We call it, Mr. President, the Valenzuela Special Education Center, Mr. President, but this will be renamed in the law to Inclusive Learning Resource Center, Mr. President. In slide 21, we have different intervention programs. For example, occupational therapy room, speech therapy room, physical therapy room. There's also a laundry room to teach life skills, Mr. President, so that the learner will become independent, especially for older learners. There's also a computer room to teach, again, life skills, especially transitioning towards employment, and a resource room, Mr. President. So just to show His Honor the type of intervention that a learning resource center will have, both for academic purposes as well as life skills in order for the learner with disability to gain gainful employment, Mr. President.
Congratulations to Valenzuela City, Mr. President, for being always ahead of in its way of thinking and addressing the problems of its constituents. Congratulations. Kailan nangyari yan, Mr. Speaker, Mr. President? Sino mayor nung time na tinayo po yan?
Mr. President, it's a continuing effort. So inumpisahan ho natin, but the good mayor, present mayor, built that structure, Mr. President. But the concept of inclusive education was started during our term, Mr. President. But in fairness, I mentioned the name Ms. Tess Pangan. She was our point person, and she advocated inclusive education and really pushed forward on its implementation in our city, Mr. President. So it's really a team effort in terms of implementation.
But our ILRC, Mr. President, has an age limit for the beneficiaries.
No, Mr. President. No. It will really again depend on the assessment of the specialist, Mr. President. But there's no age limit, but depending on the assessment and the recommendation of our specialist, Mr. President.
Okay, so I really support the effort of the sponsor. I think I was able to attend one of the hearings where this was tackled, and I congratulate the sponsor for this outside of the box thinking that we need to focus on helping learners with disabilities, cope with their disability and then function as productive as possible. So if we look at the budget, sir, where will this system be lodged? Will this be under the budget of the DepEd, or will this be an independent item, separate item in the budget?
This will be primarily under the DepEd, Mr. President, but we we are not precluding the local government to take the initiative to implement inclusive education, especially building the necessary infrastructures that will support this law, Mr. President. But primarily, the DepEd will be the one implementing this law, Mr. President.
So Mr. President, the budget to be given to the DepEd would be the for the personnel required. How about the physical premises that would be passed on to the LGUs?
Mr. President, in our bill, we directed the DepEd to be the primary agency to build, to hire the specialists, but we also gave a lot of flexibility for the LGUs because we all know that the DepEd deals with the concerns of the entire nation, and some LGUs took this advocacy as their personal advocacy, and they're willing to spend for talent as well as the infrastructure necessary. So primarily the DepEd, however, the LGU can supplement the required items to fully implement the law, Mr. President.
So for example, sir, to the Valenzuela Special Education Center that is owned by the LGU. So when this measure becomes law, will that will the physical premises be donated by the LGU to the DepEd, or there will just be an agreement that the DepEd now will run the ILRC?
Mr. President, in the case of Valenzuela, it's a DepEd sanctioned and DepEd supervised facility. Although the facility itself was built by the local government unit. The local government unit bought the land, they built the facility as shown earlier, and they hired some of the aides and the specialists that is required by the center, Mr. President. However, the curriculum, the programs, as well as the supervisor, in this case, Ms. Tess Pangan, is a DepEd employee. So that the DepEd supervises and also monitors the activities inside the center because it's important that this supervision is important because the end goal is to include them in general education. No? So the center is a form of intervention, but the end goal is for the child to enter general education. So the general education school should know exactly the programs being launched in the center, Mr. President.
Just to be clarified, Mr. President. So, for example, this bill becomes law. That particular special education center in Valenzuela will be turned over to the DepEd, so that it will be run like the ILRC. So si LGU, sir, hindi na makikialam. Wala siyang pakialam even sa hiring ng tao, even sa acceptance of the learners. In effect, nag-build lang siya and then i-contract niya siguro sa it's either a use of rock sa DepEd or any other contract, turning the physical premises over to DepEd so that the ILRC can be implemented.
Mr. President, we didn't specify in the law to give flexibility to the arrangement between the LGU and DepEd. Like in our case, it's a there's an agreement that supervision and monitoring will be undertaken by DepEd, but the cost of running and staffing and improving the facility will be with the LGU. So it's a mutual agreement on that type of arrangement. So we didn't specify in the law a turnover. We will let it. We will let the LGU and the DepEd to come up with their own arrangement regarding the center, Mr. President.
But Mr. President, does this bill mandate the LGU to provide the premises for the ILRC? Kasi ang ayaw natin mangyari, sir, is merong mga, syempre yung mga mayayaman na LGU can provide yung mga we are mentioning cities and municipalities here. So baka may municipality na hindi ma-afford, then when will we ever see the ILRC in the said municipality?
Yes,
So,
Mr.
yes, sir.
Yeah, Mr. President, we didn't mandate the turnover of the center to the DepEd. In the bill, we specified shared responsibility. So they can come up with different arrangement depending on the situation on the ground, Mr. President.
Sige, sir. But sige, sir, kung pwede yan ang pag-aralan din natin to ensure that the learner with disability in even the poorest of the municipalities will benefit under the law and will not have to travel to the city center of the regional capital. Is that the plan, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President, that's the
So-
plan,
so-
Mr. President, to make available the Learning Resource Center or ILRC to all municipalities, especially those ones with high level of learners with disabilities, Mr. President.
So, yes, sir. So, in effect, sir, this will be the school for learners with disability, and it will be for free, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would not call it the school, but I would call it an intervention center, Mr. President, with adequate resources and support services for the child, Mr. President, because the concept of inclusive education is for the child to enter the general education system, Mr. President. And the goal is to give the necessary support, necessary um, uh, intervention to the child so that the child will gain enough skills for him to thrive in the general education system, Mr. President. Of course, it will really depend on the assessment of the child. Some child will gain those skills faster than others. Some will take time. Some will spend more time in the center. It really depends on the child and the development and the growth of the child, Mr. President.
Just to be clarified, Mr. President. So, in the ILRC, we are preparing the learner with disability so that he can enter into the regular school system, or are we preparing the learner with disability to be able to live life independently, or to gain skills which will be practical to his life, to his or her life?
Both, Mr. President, both. For learner with disabilities who are in, for example, senior high school, they will be given they will be trained with life skills, Mr. President, such as what I shown in the slide earlier. For example, how to wash clothes, how to cook. In Valenzuela, we have a small kitchen there, and we train our learners with disabilities on how to cook and use the kitchen, Mr. President. So both, Mr. President, they'll be trained to, not trained, but they will be given interventions to gain skills to thrive in the general education classroom, and to those who are in senior high school to gain skills to enter the workforce.
And back to my earlier question, Mr. President, if the learner with disability never enters the general education classroom, but gains sufficient skills, is he given a certificate, or does he graduate from the ILRC system?
That's a possibility, Mr. President. We've seen cases like what you mentioned, that academic-wise, the learner with disabilities will have issues in fulfilling the academic requirement. But in terms of life skills, some of our learners disabilities can adapt quickly. So that is a possibility, depending on the assessment of the child, Mr. President. So in the bill, we included here a provision on the individualized education plan, and this plan will be based on the assessment of the child, and it will have progressive progressive timetables and developmental goals. And this IEP, Mr. President, will be the one that will guide our schools and centers on how to proceed with the necessary intervention on the child, Mr. President.
Thank you for that, Mr. Sponsor. Mr. President, at present, I think there are already some private institutions providing services like this or interventions like this, preparing the learner with disability for his or her future life, giving them, hopefully giving them practical life skills. Now, if this bill becomes law and becomes a success, it will be available nationwide in all cities and municipalities and for free. Wouldn't all the students of these private institutions currently doing this now flock to the public ILRCs? And what will happen to these institutions, Mr. President?
But, Mr. President, the ILRCs are open to anyone, Mr. President, who will require intervention and access to specialists, Mr. President. The private institutions, there's a shortage right now, Mr. President, and this was discussed yesterday by the good gentle lady from Taguig. And there's a shortage right now. And in the short to medium term, Mr. President, both the private institutions as well as this government facilities will thrive, Mr. President. I think we will probably need a lot of help, in order to fulfill the needs of our learners with disabilities. It will take a long time before we reach a point wherein these private institutions will be in competition with the public institutions, Mr. President.
We all want this measure to succeed, Mr. President. So, dapat full support tayo rito even sa budgetary support. So, pati yung pag-hire ng mga tao, iba-ibang mga specializations ito, iba-ibang mga fields. Because tama po ba, Mr. President, sabihin na when we say learners with disabilities, can we count the possible disabilities of a learner, or is this close to limitless? The combination, they can have a physical disability. There is some mental disability, a developmental disability. Ilan po ba yan, Mr. President?
That's precisely your question, Mr. President, during our hearing. I remember you asked DepEd that question. In the DepEd's categorization, they have 11 various disabilities, Mr. President. Of course, there are different degrees and spectrums in this disability, Mr. President. So, including that, it can be quite limitless, Mr. President. But in that hearing where His Honor asked the DepEd, there are about 11 medically diagnosed disability and 8 disabilities through manifestations, Mr. President.
So is it logical or reasonable to treat those as separate? So 11 plus 8, we can see there are 19. So when we design the personnel complement for the ILRCs, at least not less than 19 para merong specialista sa kada anticipated learning disability. Kasi I'm sure present naman lahat yan in all. There will be at least one siguro learner with disability in each LGU or municipality or city. So is that a reasonable way to anticipate the required manpower or personnel for this system?
Mr. President, it's very important to look at the data and the roadmap as prescribed by the law, Mr. President, because that will enable government to determine what type of specialists we will need on the ground. Different areas will have different situations. Some areas will have probably more this type of disabilities compared to others. So it really depends on what the scenario will be. So that's why in the law there are two mechanisms to see the real situation on the ground. Number one is the child find system, in which this system will proactively look for learners with disabilities. Number two is the information system, as prescribed also in the law and requested by our stakeholders, is to have a full picture of the different disabilities our learners have. And with this information, government can now make the necessary adjustment and the necessary and allocate the necessary budget to hire the specialist, allocate budget for equipment, allocate budget for infrastructure if necessary, Mr. President.
Thank you for that. That's why I asked that question, Mr. President, because we have to give full support to this measure because
Yes,
it's
Mr. President.
very important, it's timely, and we want it to succeed. So i-compute na natin ng tama ano talaga ang budget na kakailanganin dito. Sa tingin ko yung 11 plus 8 dapat yun ang minimum faculty or teaching personnel ng kada ILRC, kada munisipyo and city. So i-round off plus the supervisor, round off na natin sa 20 times 1,600 ba yun nabanggit kanina. So that's the total number minimum. So and then so that we will know that our college students now, the young people now who will choose a career in this field will know that there is a career waiting because for them, because this will be an institutionalized system, yung ILRC system.
Thank you, Mr. President. His Honor pointed out a very good effect of the law. When this bill becomes a law, it will also trigger what is required by the government and also by the law. And it will now trigger, or it's a form of signaling on what students can take in order to gain employment in this type of field, Mr. President. So I can see that the law also creates demand for different specialties, and that signals the market, or that signals at least the senior high school students on what type of courses they will take, because there's a demand for those type of specialists, Mr. President.
Mr. President, with the permission of the two gentlemen.
Okay, ma'am.
Yes, Senator Cayetano.
Thank you. Very short. This discussion right now on how the law would trigger job opportunities and give the students an idea of what career path they can take. I recall in the hearing of His Honor, the chair of the Committee on Basic Education, when we had as the resource persons, I think it was the Association of the Guidance Counselor, does His Honor recall? They were pointing out to us that there is no career path for guidance counselors. It's like a dead end. I think there are just 2 levels, something like that. So it's the way we structured our plantilla in DepEd for guidance counselor does not in any way encourage them to be guidance counselors. So I think we took this up in connection with mental health of young students. And so I'd like to point out that this discussion is very relevant, the points raised by Senator Pimentel. And I think I would, at this point, maybe ask His Honor to consider crafting a provision that really goes deeper than we normally do, because otherwise, again, it might end up like the guidance counselor. I would hazard a guess that the need for guidance counselor is still bigger because every student would somehow need access to a guidance counselor as opposed to the percentage of students who have learning disabilities, right? And yet, if we cannot fill the guidance counselor positions, what more those other specialized positions? So beyond recognizing it, I think we need to really craft stronger provisions that ensures that these positions are created and even the career path so that it really becomes something that a student would look forward to. That's just my input to the two gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, the good gentle lady from Taguig. That's a very good suggestion that we don't want the specialist to end up with zero career path. In fact, part of the encouragement or part of the incentive for this specialist to work in government is they see some progression in their careers. And it's a good suggestion, and we will definitely include that in our list of improvements in the bill.
And one more suggestion, Mr. President, to the good sponsor. When we give publicity to this bill, can we mention already in the press release can we mention the courses which will be deemed important or made important under this bill? Para kasi it takes time to produce graduates in these courses, all the more for specialists to produce specialists.
Yes, Mr. President, that's a good way of attracting specialists to, well, it's a good way to attract potential specialists, those who are still studying in senior high school to take up these courses, and those
Yes,
who are in college to attract them to work for government or at least give some time to government service.
If Your Honor already knows these courses, pwede ba can we mention them para malaman ko na rin, ikakalat ko na rin yung courses?
Specialist. Well, number one, Mr. President, is the special needs education.
Is that, sir, a specific course in tertiary education? Ganyan?
Yes, it's already
good.
it's a specific course. Used to be special. They call it special education, but the terminologies have changed, and now it's called special needs education, focusing on the needs. And then we will also require guidance counselors, developmental pediatricians, physical therapists, actually, but it's not a problem in our country. We have abundant physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech language pathologists. These are the specialists that we will need to launch a intervention to provide intervention, Mr. President.
Okay, and siguro pati psychologist and psychiatrist siguro, no, sir?
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay.
Correct, Mr.
Sige.
President.
Just my final area of interest, sir. How is the intervention being done today to help learners with disability?
Mr. President, generally speaking, some LGUs, especially in Metro Manila, have this type of special education centers already. I have seen some of those special education centers, and the concept is largely the same. There are specialists, there are equipment, and there are training aids that provide interventions to our learners with disabilities. But generally, they are in what we call integrated classrooms. So special needs teachers are the ones assigned to teach learners with disabilities in classrooms inside of our school premises. So meaning the child is inside the school, but he's segregated to a different classroom, and that classroom is staffed with a special education teacher. And the reason for that, Mr. President, is because of the lack of assessment. So there is a general treatment to there's a general treatment of learners with disabilities in our schools, Mr. President. So it's not the concept that we are promoting here, but because of the lack of access to specialists, that became a sort of like a interim method to teach our learners with disabilities.
So thank you for that, sir. So talagang ano yung concept mo dito? Whole of is it whole of community approach?
Whole of community approach, Mr. President.
We really need this, no? Even yung sa mga estudyante pa lang ngayon, kailangan ihanda na nila yung plano nila. Ito na lang, sir, tignan natin yung council. May council yata. What's the relationship with the DepEd? Baka magkagulo-gulo sila.
Mr. President, in the past, kanina term yun? May council. During the term of Secretary Luistro, he established an advisory council composed of different organizations from the composed of organizations from different disabilities, Mr. President, and it became an effective way to get suggestions, consult, and get advice from the stakeholders themselves. And it was not continued under this present administration, and that's one of the effective ways of getting a broader view on how to improve our methodology in reaching out to our learners with disabilities. I've interacted with these groups, Mr. President, and they are so passionate. And in fact, a lot of them took continuously update their knowledge on how to educate our learners with disabilities. And it's good to tap into their knowledge base. And it's good for DepEd to tap into their knowledge base, Mr. President. So the advisory council is set up without any compensation or numeration, Mr. President. It's basically a advisory body that will help DepEd come up with policies and programs that will help our learners with disabilities, Mr. President.
Thank you, sir. At any rate, I think the bill is clear, no? That this include ILRC system will be implemented by the DepEd because the bill calls for the creation of a bureau precisely for this purpose, Mr. President.
Mr. President, we after consulting with the stakeholders and DepEd, we are amending this. This bureau, Mr. President. There's an existing bureau now. It's called the Bureau of Learning Delivery, Mr. President. And the reason for that, Mr. President, is we don't want a separate bureau for our learners with disabilities because it highlights the difference between our learners with disabilities and our learners in general education. So the concept here is inclusion. So meaning our learners with disabilities at one point should be included in general education. And the way forward to do that is to provide services and intervention, Mr. President. So after consulting with our stakeholders, especially experts in UP, headed by Dr. Bustos, we will amend that and integrate the implementation of this law to the existing structure of DepEd.
Anyway, at any rate, that really clarifies that the DepEd is the agency in charge. So I manifest my full support, Mr. President, Mr. Sponsor, for your bill and request that I also be made a co-author and allow us to also help you anticipate some of the possible problems in implementing such a large program, and then dapat if we are in full support of the measure, let be an all-out support even up to the budgetary needs of the program, because I think this really needs a big budgetary support, because we cannot leave the implementation of the program at the generosity of the LGUs. Kasi kung napansin nga natin, nabanggit ni sponsor na there are already interventions in special education here in Metro Manila. So kung wala tayong ma-cite na LGU outside of Metro Manila, that means that budget is important. So kailangan na medyo mayaman na LGU for the current system in intervening in special education to be implemented. So this is a very good measure, but it needs our complete support all the way up to the budget process. So congratulations to the sponsor, Mr. President, and thank you for your patience giving me the time.
Thank you, Mr. President,
Alright.
and thank you for manifesting your intention to be a co-author, co-sponsor of this bill. It's an honor, Mr. President. I know His Honor has a lot of experience also in the realm of education and governance, and it will be a great privilege for His Honor to be part of this measure, Mr. President. And likewise, we welcome suggestions that will improve the bill. I know His Honor is he's very sharp when it comes to sharpening the bill. So we welcome his insights and his suggestions to improve the bill on hand. So thank you very
Alright.
much,
Thank
Mr.
you,
President.
Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, there are no members who wish to interpolate this measure. I move that we close the period of interpolation.
Any objection? Hearing none, period of interpellation is closed.
I believe, Mr. President, a number of our colleagues would like to submit to the distinguished sponsor their amendments. So we can give it a bit more time and properly open the period of amendments next week, if it's all right with the good sponsor, Mr. President.
All right.
So with
Yes.
that, we move to suspend consideration of the measure.
Hearing no objection, consideration of the measure suspended. Majority Leader, can we have a few minutes of suspension?
Yes, I was about to say, Mr.
Alright.
President, I noticed that you were a bit tired and needed a bit of a break.
Mm.
So I move, Mr.
Yes.
President, for a Senate suspension. 5
All right.
minutes suspension.
Session suspended.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader, yes.
I move to resume Senate Bill number 1933 under Committee Report number 147.
Any objection? Hearing none, consideration of the measure is in order.
To the sponsor of the bill is Senator Risa Ontiveros, and to interpellate is Senator Pia Cayetano.
All right, Senator Rizal Taveras is recognized to sponsor the measure and to interpellate the Senator Pia Cayetano.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. With the permission of Her Honor, I would like to propound some questions and maybe at some point offer some suggestions. But I'd like to start with the purpose of the bill and then take it from there.
Certainly, Mr. President and good gentlewoman from Taguig and Pateros, when I first sponsored this bill in December, it was in the spirit of moving forward. It would be a great Christmas gift for prospective adoptive parents and children who could be adopted into their own families. And now in the month of February, making progress on this bill will in turn be a great Valentine's gift to both of them, especially, Mr. President, good gentlewoman, in the light of recent reports about which there was a resolution referred just today about illegal adoptions through Facebook. So one of the various concerns that this bill seeks to address. So by all means, good gentlewoman and Mr. President.
Thank you. For the record, I have a Senate bill that is a comprehensive bill on adoption and alternative childcare, which I don't believe was taken up in crafting of this bill. So in the course of my interpellation, I may refer to some provisions there because my professional experience on this matter also comes from my being the previous chair for 6 years of the Committee on Women and Children. And then I also actively participated and crafted the House version of the said Senate bill that I mentioned when I was in the House of Representatives. And
Yes, Mr.
finally, I am an
President.
adoptive parent. So on that note, I hope Her Honor would understand where I am coming from. It is both personal and it is both based on my personal and professional experience.
I certainly understand, good gentlewoman, Mr. President. And if I recall correctly, in the earlier stages of the crafting of this bill, practically the sole and only reason that it was not possible to combine the good gentlewoman's bill and this committee report was because of the proposal about a certain organizational arrangement regarding the DSWD. But moving forward in this interpellation, I'm certainly open to listening to and trying to respond to the questions of the good gentlewoman, and at the proper time also considering her proposed amendments. And I wish to assure Mr. President, the good gentlewoman, that the DSWD, which is also following our interpellation, is also prepared to look at possible organizational changes in trying to fulfill the objectives of this bill, Mr. President.
I actually don't know the reason. That's not the reason that was relayed to us. But I'll not get into it. It will just be relevant when I ask certain questions, because normally when a bill of a very similar nature is filed, the reason why you take them up together is so that precisely you could compare the different provisions. And of course, it is the chair's prerogative to choose which one he or she believes is the best. So not having it considered officially, I don't know then how you proceed in that manner. In that case, I will, to the extent that it's relevant to this bill, I will have to mention it because, as I said, it was not included. So I don't know in what way Her Honor or her staff was able to take it into consideration. So on that note, let me proceed with Her Honor's permission.
Certainly, Mr. President.
So I'll try to keep this simple. Do I gather correctly that the main objective of this bill is to provide a expeditious but obviously still a safe mechanism or procedure for adoption? In other words, we know that the process of adoption can be lengthy, and therefore the main objective of this bill would be to provide an administrative adoption as now the one and only, not even an alternative, but the only mode of finalizing an adoption of a child. And as I said, is that correct? That the main objective is really to expedite the process. Her Honor's in mute. Her Honor's on mute.
I'm sorry about that. That is correct, Mr. President, good gentlewoman. As stated in Section 3 objective, this act shall provide for and allow simpler and inexpensive domestic administrative adoption proceedings. The good gentlewoman is probably familiar that currently, because of the judicial processes required for adoption, adoptions can take on average as long as 2 to 3 years in order to be concluded. One objective of this bill is to shorten that period to several or many months, hopefully within a 1-year time frame, while at the same time, as the good gentlewoman said, still providing for the protection of the child in the best interests of the child. And the simpler adoption proceedings are contemplated through administrative proceedings rather than the judicial proceedings that are now required and on which are rooted the existing or the current executive order and 5 Republic Acts, which have to do with various aspects of adoption, Mr. President.
Thank you. So so I just wanted to establish that so that at least when I proceed with my questions, it's clear to me that my understanding of the primary purpose of this bill is clear, and that is my understanding. So thank you for that. So Her Honor specifically said that currently it may take 2 to 3 years, and I'm sure Her Honor has also had the opportunity to speak with adoptive parents who have had horror stories about the judicial process itself, not just the delays, but sometimes sadly, how do I put it, the insensitivity also of some judges, which is a little bit surprising to me considering that these are already family court judges, no? But I've heard it from adoptive parents I know. So, and I see Her Honor nodding her head. So
Yes, Mr. President.
we are both in accord on knowing, understanding the experiences of these parents, no? So when Her Honor says it takes around 2 to 3 years, sometimes longer, Her Honor is referring to the entire process.
That is correct, Mr. President. One of the main features of the existing adoption laws, when we compared it with this Senate Bill 1933, is that the finalization in court can take from 1 to 3 years. So actually, Mr. President, good gentlewoman, that may not yet include the pre-adoption proceedings. That is just the judicial proceedings proper, Mr. President.
So based on Her Honor's knowledge, it could take 1 to 3 years, and I think 1 year is a good. It would already be considered a good response. No, I mean any of the practicing lawyers here would say to resolve something in 1 year is pretty good already. So Her Honor is saying 1 to 3 years on the judicial side. So what about on the
Yes, Mr.
pre-judicial side? During this period, for the sake of our colleagues who are not that familiar with the process, I'll just summarize it. But basically, there's the case study to determine the competence, to determine exactly the status of the child, and then to look into the status of the adoptive parents. What is their family situation? Are they married? Are they happily? Do they have a happy home together? They're financially stable, blah, blah, blah. And then you have the matching process. And then after that, you have the issuance of the pre-adoption placement authority. I'm basing this on the bill more or less, but it is more or less the practice also now. and then there's the trial custody. So all of this happens prior to the filing of a adoption in court. How long does this process take currently, Madam Sponsor?
Mr. President, good gentlewoman, per the DSWD, those steps in the pre-adoption process, even before the potential adoptive parents and the child can get to the court process proper, could take as long as 11 months. So halos po isang taon din yung pre-court process bago pa tumuntong dun sa court proceedings, which could take at least 1 year or even up to 3 years. So for example, good gentlewoman, Mr. President, the regional and interregional matching conference could happen within 1 month, except for the cases of relatives and adults. Before that regional or interregional matching conference, there could be about 4 months within which there's a processing for the CD-CLAA, the Certificate of Declaration of the Child as legally available for adoption. After the 1 month regional or interregional matching conference would be what the good gentlewoman mentioned, the supervised trial custody or STC with regular monitoring, which could take as long as 6 months or half a year. So first, the 4 months to process the CD-CLAA or that certificate, plus a month for the regional or interregional matching conference, and then 6 months of the supervised trial custody. So halos isang taon po, Mr. President, good gentlewoman, before even going into the further procedures with DSWD and the judicial process itself, Mr. President.
Thank you for that. And for I'm sure Her Honor knows this. I'm also very familiar because being adoptive mother, I've gone through the process. But to spread it into the record, the social worker that attends to these documentations that are going to be prepared could be a DSWD social worker or could be a accredited DSWD, a social worker from an accredited agency. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. President. All of these are either in-house department social workers or social workers in the accredited agencies, Mr.
Okay.
President.
Does Her Honor have the figures as to how many children were declared legally available for adoption 2020? Maybe 2020 was as a different kind of year, so maybe in the last few years, how many children were declared for adoption?
Yes, Mr. President, good gentlewoman. I actually have the figures from DSWD for a considerably longer stretch of years. This is their data from 2009 till 2020. The department says that they were able to issue 8,036 CD-CLAAs or certificates declaring the child legally available for adoption. Both po for domestic adoption and inter-country adoption, so 8,036. Of these 8,000 plus, 3,101 CD-CLAAs were actually facilitated within the ideal turnaround time for facilitating CD-CLAAs. They were facilitated within the ideal TAT of 22 days for abandoned children and within 17 days for surrendered children. However, good gentlewoman, Mr. President, it's worth noting that of those 8,036 children who were issued CD-CLAAs, only 1,243 of them, or about 15% of those certified as available for adoption, actually umabot po sa final decree of adoption. So 15% lang po, at least in terms of domestic adoption. Ibig sabihin po, a maximum of 85% of these children, though legally available for adoption, ay hindi pa talaga napa-adopt sa kanilang adoptive parents, Mr. President.
Can you repeat that number? How many
Yes,
were
Mr.
legally
President.
adopted? How many?
1,243 were domestically adopted out of 8,036 who were issued CD class for both domestic and intercountry adoption.
So that's the 15%.
It would be 15%, good gentlewoman.
Your Honor, the number I have is 8,027. The number you have is 8,036. So it's just a difference of
Yes,
9.
Mr.
I don't know
President.
why. I don't know why we have different numbers, but if they're very similar,
I'll
so
check
never
with
mind.
DSWD. All right, Mr.
It
President.
doesn't matter. It matters because those are 9 children, but nevertheless, it's
Yes.
still in the 8,000 range. It's less than 1%. Let's use Her Honor's number, 8,036.
Mr. President.
8,036 is over a period of 12 years.
Yes, Mr.
And
President.
so that means if I divide it by 12, although there are specific details, if I divide it by 12, there is. If I divide it by 12, that's 670 children were given CDC class.
Yes, Mr. President.
600
Every year.
only.
Opo.
Yeah, 600 every year. And the data I have, I don't know if Her Honor has other data, is that it was estimated that there's 1,800 neglected and abandoned children in the country. This is United Nations data. It's 1.8 million, what did I say? Sorry, 1.8 million. 1.8 million abandoned and neglected children. That's a number that came from UN. I have not seen any other number. 1.8 million. And here we are preparing the document. DSWD tells us that they have been able to prepare the document for 600 children a year.
That's a
Are they
very
doing their
small
job?
percentage,
Are
good
they doing their
gentlewoman.
job? Even if I assume, and I don't have the numbers, perhaps Her Honor does, of the 1.8 million abandoned and neglected children, let's assume that 50% of them do have biological parents who maybe are just temporarily unable to provide them with the love and care that they deserve. So we're still talking about 1 million children. And here we are placing 600 children.
And that's
When
only
Her Honor reports to
0.03%.
me, when Her Honor reports to me that there are now 600 children, DSWD has been able to go through their record, but the problem is with the courts. No, I beg to disagree. I agree that there is a problem with the delay in the courts, can be improved. But what about the delay in DSWD? What about the 1 million children out there, 1.8 million children who are abandoned and neglected? And they tell us that they process 600. Let's just go to another issue that every single senator is very familiar with. Yung SAP. Inabot ng ilang buwan para ilabas yung SAP. Pera lang 'yon, hindi tao. Tapos nung sinabi ng nag-decide na let DSWD handle the second round of SAP 9 months para ilabas 'yon. So, I go back to my first question. What is the objective of this bill? And the response of Your Honor is to expedite in a safe manner for the best interest of the child that they find homes. Well, is the solution simply to remove the role of the judiciary? Or are there other things that we can do within the administrative level that will also expedite this process?
Yes, Mr. President. It is the perception in the bill that providing for domestic administrative adoption proceedings will achieve the purpose of placing those children who are legally available for adoption in the homes, in the families who apply to take care of them through the prospective adoptive parents. Indeed, the number of 1.8 million abandoned and neglected children is a very large number, which gives rise to deep and urgent concern in the hearts of all of us. Perhaps it is unfortunate that not more of them are actually offered for adoption and that not more parents volunteer to be able to adopt them. However, if we look even just at the smaller field in the data given to us by DSWD, if only more of the 8,036 children who were issued CD class within the recent 12-year period could be placed in homes and families with potential adoptive parents, that would still constitute almost more than 7,000 more children becoming new members of 7,000 more families. Additionally, Mr. President, good gentlewoman, if we make adoption easier through an administrative process, it may even encourage more parents to adopt. So the problem isn't all DSWD inefficiency. And I would be glad to share, Mr. President, with the good gentlewoman some other data about the current human resource component or complement rather of the DSWD, with which they have been able still to do something these past years in terms of adoption. And I do believe that through an administrative process, they will indeed be able to do more for these children, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think we need to clarify what we are discussing. Her Honor is focusing on the fact that 8,000 CD class were issued. Okay, and for the sake of our colleagues and to spread it into the record, CD class is the certificate that a child is legally available for adoption. So that means they went through the process, the SWD or others, accredited social workers went through the process of checking if talagang abandoned na itong batang to, wala na ba talagang magulang. And after going through the process, yes, this child may now be abandoned. Okay, so DSWD now tells us, eto na, we have declared for a freaking term of 12 years, we have declared 8,000 children available. So what now? After that, they still have to find the matches. They still have to find the parents. And that is still on DSWD, the Department of Social Welfare. Who else will do it? Her Honor said it is unfortunate that there were no other parents. No, it is not unfortunate. They are not doing their job. And that is why I am asking Her Honor if by simply, and I have no problem with an administrative form of adoption, I am on board on this. I am simply asking Her Honor, is there a need to look into the process that goes on in DSWD to also expedite this process further and not simply say, let's be happy because now these 8,000 kids who have been given the certificate that they can be adopted, they will now be processed right away because they will not be going through judicial. No, that is not the next step. The next step is the matching, finding the parents who can be a match, and so on. And that is still administrative. How is that addressed? How is that issue addressed in this bill? That is my question, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. President, good gentlewoman. I'll approach that latest question from three starting points. One, Mr. President, is that not all one of the 1.8 million children, not all the children in residential care facilities are automatically suitable for adoption. Some are in fact for
just to
I beg
say,
your pardon?
we agree on that, Madam
Yes.
Madam Sponsor, because I pointed
Yes.
out earlier, let's even assume na 50% lang naman ang dapat ma-adopt. So I
Alright.
just wanted to interject that I'm okay with that. I'm not assuming that
Thank you,
all
Mr.
1.8.
President.
I am the author of the foster care bill, so I do know, and I will even hazard a guess that more have to be in foster care rather than adopted. So I'm on board with that, with what you're trying to say, that not necessarily 1.8 need to be adopted.
Thank you, Mr. President, good gentlewoman. Let me also point out, because I mentioned earlier that despite human resource limitations, still the DSWD has been able to try to apply itself to this task. May I draw the good gentlewoman's attention to the fact that by position in the DSWD central office, there are actually only 22 social workers, 8 of them permanent and 14 of them on contract of service status. The statisticians are even fewer, Mr. President. There are only 2 in the DSWD central office. And speaking of administration, there are only 3 administrative staff in the DSWD central office. So looking at that, perhaps the 600 a year is still, while a long way from serving all the children who could possibly be adopted, shows some level of efficiency on the part of the central office. In the field offices of DSWD, and this is all over the country, Mr. President, good gentlewoman, their social workers would only amount to 102, 38 permanent and 64 contract of service. The statisticians, Mr. President, in the field offices, 0 of whatever employment status. And the administrative staff all across the country, Mr. President, only 20. And so that is the reason, Mr. President, good gentlewoman, that one of the provisions in this Senate Bill 1933 seeks that in addition to the group of licensed social workers from the DSWD and the accredited agencies who can make those assessment and home study reports, or HSRs, that other social workers with at least 3 years experience in handling adoption cases, as certified or accredited by the DSWD, could also make the assessment and HSR to provide more of a pool of social workers in anticipation of the increase of the number of prospective adoptive parents. So in the bill, Mr. President, good gentlewoman, is the hope that if we provide for a shorter, less expensive administrative proceeding as compared with the current judicial one, that more parents will be encouraged to go in for this adoption process of children who are available for adoption. And also there will be a complement from other social workers who can assist the DSWD to more effectively and efficiently undertake this task, Mr. President.
I thank Her Honor for that information. And yes, I also support the need and the mandate for the authority to accredit more social workers. I have a couple of things I'd like to spread into the record on that, though. Is Her Honor aware that we do have a shortage of social workers in the country? So if Her Honor had the chance to follow the discussion on inclusive education,
Yes.
that's also something similar. It is similar in the sense that you can mandate it, but if there is no provision there in the bill, that would require CHED to also act on it, to promote this actively as a viable career for young people. Again, it remains a desire. It remains to be a vague dream for us to just have more social workers. So may I ask Her Honor to consider including a provision that would also mandate that our agencies work together to also project the need for social workers, to include it as priority courses. If it should be a priority, I leave that to Her Honor. But to ensure that the demand that the schools that will provide for the social work programs are on speed with what we're trying to do, because otherwise, with the current setup, we don't have enough social workers.
Indeed, Mr. President, the good gentlewoman was reading my mind. I did, when she started on this line of observation, I did recall the previous interpellation of the inclusive education bill. And yes, at the proper time, I will favorably consider a proposed amendment in terms of the CHED encouraging tertiary level students, higher education students, to consider, a greater number of them to consider a career in social work, to take care of various needs in our society, including the one we are considering now. Additionally, Mr. President, a reason that more social workers for this and other tasks would be important is that we can't overly expedite and simplify the process before the issuance of the CD class because we need to check against trafficking. And this, I'm reminded of the issue recently out in the media and in public conversations about illegal adoption through Facebook. So it's a similar concern that we want to guard against in terms of the possible trafficking of children, Mr. President.
Yes, we share the same concern, and that's why I always go back to that what is the objective of the bill, and that we both agree that we want an expeditious adoption process, but always safe, not
Yes.
not creating any shortcuts or loopholes that can be taken advantage of. So we are on the same page when it comes to that. But going back to the point on accrediting more social workers. I I actually have made intervention. This representation has made intervention that actually addresses this trafficking issue on point, because instead of just accrediting social workers, we actually inserted into the budget of DSWD additional plantilla positions for social workers. Is Her Honor familiar with this?
Yes, Mr. President, good gentlewoman, it was a very good feature of our GAA.
So these are the kind of interventions that I was hoping to see in the bill to ensure that the agency is properly equipped to do its job. And so another intervention we made in the 2021 GAA is also to promote precisely what we discussed: social work and guidance counseling, which goes into inclusive education. Well, not so much inclusive education, but just mental health and overall wellness of the children. We put that funding in CHED so that CHED can start promoting these courses and helping. I think it would be like for workshops to help other SUCs to come up with these courses. Now,
Yes,
I
Mr.
mentioned-
President, good gentlewoman, just for the record, I would like to affirm what the good gentlewoman has said, that it was the intervention of Senator Pia for 35 million pesos precisely for the hiring of currently contractual social workers as regular plantilla social workers. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. But let me now emphasize the reason we did this and the reason we remain concerned about the focus of this bill. Mr. President, as it currently is drafted, the reason I point out, and Her Honor doesn't have any other figures, so we're working with the 1.8 million abandoned and neglected children. And since unless DSW has given her more details, we don't know how many of those should be adopted or should be put in foster care. But at the very least, that is their status. They should be adopted or in foster care, because they are generally termed as abandoned and neglected, and therefore they cannot be, at least for the time being, with their biological parents. So I don't know the number. I don't know if it's divided, if it's 25% should be adopted, if it's 50%. So for lack of any other number, I just know that it's less than 1.8, but definitely a huge number, hundreds of thousands of children that need a permanent home, and another hundreds of thousands of children that need a temporary home. So on that note, let me point out that
Mr. President, before the good gentlewoman proceeds, one of the 5 current laws having to do with various aspects of adoption is actually a law on, it's the Republic Act number 10165, or the Foster Care Act. So perhaps a fuller implementation of this law would also be able to place more of these 1 million plus abandoned and neglected children in more suitable foster care arrangements, in addition to or aside from adoption, Mr. President.
yes, that is the law I'm referring to that I sponsor. That is my law, Madam Sponsor, the foster care law. That's why I said I'm very familiar with foster care, and I would hazard that there are more children that should be put in foster care than those that should be adopted. And I said I'm hazarding because I am not a data scientist. I need to rely on data to be able to come up with that actual amount. But I do believe that families, I mean, I think it is our policy that families should be united whenever possible, and that is why we strengthen the foster care law. So we're
That is
very familiar with that.
And that is also why, good gentlewoman, that even in this Senate bill seeking administrative proceedings for adoption, the same pre-adoption processes will be undertaken as are already being undertaken now, including the interview by the social workers of the potential adoptive child's birth parents, if they are known and if they are present, just to ensure that reunification is not the optimal situation for this potentially adopted child, and that therefore the processing of the CD-CLAA may proceed, Mr. President.
Yes, I am also very familiar with that, which just brings me to my next point, which is you have the same bureau handling all of these things, and nothing has changed under this bill. Nothing further strengthens their capacity, nothing increases the number of social workers on it, nothing. And so I have no idea how the delays or the lack of manpower that they are currently experiencing, and please be informed that the 35 million that I inserted into the budget is just a fraction of what is needed. It's an amount, I think the initial proposal was, I don't know, not 187 million. So what is 35? That's about a quarter, less than a quarter, maybe a fifth or a sixth of what was desired to be able to maybe come closer to the goal of placing these children to the point that they can file a petition for adoption, whether it's in the courts if we don't pass this law yet, or in the administrative through administrative proceedings. So that is the point I'm trying to make, Your Honor. What in the bill is addressing these concerns? And I'll say it out straight. The bureau in charge of handling these children that need to be placed, the bureau in charge of handling this, I'm just looking for my notes. The bureau in charge of handling the placement of these children is called the Program Management Bureau of DSWD. They also handle all programs prescribed by law concerning children, youth, senior citizens, and persons with disabilities. Would Her Honor like me to, well, let me go on. What are those specific functions of this Program Management Bureau? They supervise and monitor operations and implementation of all programs and projects related to disadvantaged children, youth, women, PWDs, older persons, and families and communities. They provide technical assistance on the aforesaid programs and projects. They develop and implement an operations review and evaluation system for these programs and projects. They develop and institutionalize mechanisms to establish and maintain networks and alliances at the national level to support the implementation of these programs. Sa madaling salita, they're doing everything that is needed in this country to assist children, youth, women, PWDs, older persons, the entire family, and the entire community. So how did this bill address the workload that these people are currently handling? How will we be able to expedite and achieve our common goal, which we have identified, Your Honor?
Mr. President, the conditions that the good gentlewoman has described coincide also with the common reasons for delay identified by the DSWD itself in terms of the movement of cases for adoption. For example, Mr. President, the limited number of social workers handling the program, which the good gentlewoman and I have been talking about. The DSWD says that the majority of LGUs have one or two social workers managing all the programs and services in their locality. And there is no social worker solely assigned in alternative
Yes, we know that.
parental care.
We
They
know that,
are,
ma'am.
yes,
That's why we're asking, what does the bill do to address this? So you're basically telling me, Her Honor is telling me that what I'm saying coincide with what DSD is saying. I know that. So what does the bill do to address that? That is the question, Your Honor.
yes, Mr. President. I'm simply putting on record observations of the DSWD, which coincide with the observations of the good gentlewoman, and which also explain why the DSWD has a proposal for additional staff, both in their central office and in their field offices. Staff
But Her Honor did
including
not carry that proposal. I'm not aware that that proposal
which
is the proposal for plantilla positions, the proposal to strengthen the bureau, or even a proposal to have a separate bureau that will solely be dedicated to the needs of placing abandoned and neglected children. That is not carried in the bill. Am I mistaken?
which is why, Mr. President, good gentlewoman, these proposals of the DSWD on additional staff in their central and field offices, and they have detailed which staffers they are, I would be happy to accept as the subject of amendments from the good gentlewoman at the proper time to reinforce and improve the capacity of the DSWD to handle domestic adoption concerns, and also to accept an amendment for a separate bureau with these new plantilla positions, Mr. President.
But did Her Honor not see the importance of this when this bill was being heard and during the TWDs? Again, I simply mention this because these are concerns that we tried to address in our bill that Her Honor chose not to include. And that's why I bring it up, simply because Her Honor is now telling me, and I am grateful that she sees the importance of addressing these concerns by way of strengthening the bureau, and or, which is my proposal, to have a totally independent bureau. I'm just wondering why this is not something that was included in the committee report.
Mr. President, good gentlewoman, to reiterate, I am happy to accept an amendment at the proper time for a separate bureau with the new plantilla positions within the DSWD.
But Her Honor did not feel that there was an importance to do that when during the time that the report was being prepared.
Well, Mr. President, I suppose the important thing now is for me to signify to the good gentlewoman that before the bill can possibly be passed into law, that this amendment, this proposed amendment, will be welcome in order to improve the organizational capacities of the DSWD, and above and beyond that, in order to strengthen and improve the adoption services to the children legally available for adoption and to the prospective adoptive parents whose numbers we hope will increase. Further, Mr. President, this bill focuses on the process, not on the lack of resources, although that is always an important need that we seek to respond to better every year, especially in our budget process. And as I have said, I am open to enrichment, further enrichment of this bill during the period of amendments, Mr. President.
Thank you for that, but I'd just like to emphasize that the process cannot solve the problem if there is a lack of understanding of where the problem lies. And that's precisely why I am emphasizing that, because of my personal experiences and because of my experiences having chaired the committee and having worked on similar bills when I was in the House, we are familiar with where the issues lie. And we were hoping that we would have the chance during the committee hearings to already propose this to make the job of Her Honor simpler, that those proposals would be considered. Given that they were not, I am happy that Her Honor is considering it now. But what I'd like to also take up now is this. So what we talked about is a separate bureau that would be totally dedicated to addressing abandoned and neglected children. Thank you for that. But is Her Honor
And
aware
further, Mr.
that
President, good gentlewoman, our stakeholders, including especially the adoptive parents, at least during the hearings, they didn't complain about the DSWD process. Just for the record, Mr. President.
I don't know who your stakeholders you invited, but I have been in many stakeholders meeting, both as an adoptive parent myself and as a legislator, and the first thing that they complain about is the process. So we may be listening to different stakeholders. I cannot comment on that. I cannot.
Or perhaps, Mr. President, good gentlewoman, since the common complaint is something or other about the process, I believe that is why a main focus of attention of this bill is to provide by law that administrative proceedings shall be sufficient under the law to place children legally available for adoption in families with their prospective adoptive parents, Mr. President.
Yes, but Madam Sponsor, that statement fails to recognize that there is also a failure in the delivery of the services in the administrative level prior to the petition for adoption. Her Honor's bill, with all due respect, is addressing a problem that we both recognize, which is the judicial phase, which we are now changing into administrative phase. But Her Honor has basically agreed with me earlier that in the pre-adoption stage, where we go through the matching, and prior to that, before the issuance of the certificate of authority to be adopted and all that, that whole process is not being addressed. So that's why I go back to the purpose of the bill. What is the purpose of the bill? To expedite the adoption. What are the causes of the delays? Judiciary, check. We are addressing that. How about in the administration, in the implementing agency? There are causes for delay too as well. Are we addressing that? And I humbly submit that the bill does not address that. So Her Honor has recognized that by saying that she is open to strengthen the bureau, or in fact create another bureau altogether to address that. So that's all I'm saying. That let's address that other issue. And
Indeed,
Her
Mr.
Honor has
President,
agreed, correct?
which is why, as I have said earlier, Mr. President, we will improve the DSWD's resources in the period of amendments in order to address their capacity building for these adoption proceedings.
Thank you. And but to take it further, Mr. President, I wanted to find out if Her Honor is familiar with practices in other jurisdictions about wherein there are separate agencies altogether that handle adoption. Is Her Honor familiar with such cases?
That could be the case, Mr. President. However, we are treating here of currently judicial proceedings as they have evolved here in the Philippines. And then over the years, with inputs from the various stakeholders, including the adoptive parents themselves, seeking to evolve it to be more responsive. And that is why we are seeking the support of the Senate for administrative proceedings for adoption, Mr. President.
Yes, I'm not questioning that. I've already said a number of times that we support this move to make it administrative. My question was, is Her Honor familiar with the practice in other countries, in other jurisdictions, wherein they have an independent body handling the processing of the adoption and the entire adoption process? I'm just asking, is Her Honor familiar?
I'm less familiar, Mr. President, good gentlewoman, with those practices handled by a totally separate structure in other countries. What is very clear to me until this point in time is that, one, the adoptive parents who were also part of the hearings themselves unanimously said that they want DSWD to handle adoption proceedings without judicial proceedings, and they welcome that this new administrative adoption proceeding be administered within the DSWD. Although, as I said earlier, it could be within a new bureau in the department, Mr. President.
And I appreciate Her Honor spreading that into the record, but I don't know if it is just the adoptive parents who should be asked about this question. Number one, their main concern is their child, no, their personal experience. As I always say, I also have that personal experience, but perhaps it would be the caregiving agencies, the other stakeholders, the actual parties involved in handling the adoption process that could shed light on this. And let me just proceed so that I can spread it into the record. This is how it is set up in other countries. In Norway, adoption applications are processed by the regional offices of the Children, Youth, and Family Affairs Services. It is a professional body in the area of child welfare and adoption family protection. It is responsible for the whole process, and it's an 8-step process. In Denmark, the Minister of Justice sets out the rules for approval of prospective adopters and for adoption proceedings. In Thailand, the Child Adoption Center of the Thai Department of Social Development and Welfare is the government agency in charge of overseeing all child adoptions. So in those 3 cases that I mentioned, there's a separate entity, Your Honor. I'm just mentioning it. I think it adds to our wealth of information when we know how things are being done. And then here in our own country, we have ICAB, which is the Inter-Country Adoption Board, wherein they handle, after a child is declared as available for adoption, they then handle the process of adoption for adoptive parents in other countries. Now, I mentioned this because in her honors, in the committee report filed, the process as I understand it, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, the groundwork is done by the regional office of DSWD. And then this is submitted. This is already the adoption, the application for to declare the child as legally available for adoption. It would be submitted then to the regional. Hold on, let me just.
That is correct, Mr. President.
Okay, there we go. So just let me go over that. I'll start from the top. The case study and home study, we discussed that already, then they match it. And then there's an issuance of a pre-adoption placement authority by DSWD. Let me stop right there because the data we have is that this pre-adoption placement authority, of the 8,027, the number I have, but Her Honor has 8,036 children that were placed over the span of 12 years. Only 2,669 children, or about a third, were issued pre-adoption placement authorities, and those are all still within the confines of the implementing agency, DSWD. So I wanted to emphasize that na wow, 8,000 na nga lang yung na-process, and then hindi pa natuloy yung process all the way. Only 2,669 of them were given pre-adoption placement authorities. So 5,358 children did not have pre-adoption placement authorities. So what happened to them? Where's the delay? I don't know if Her Honor has details other than what I know. Hindi lang naaasikaso. They're overworked, they're understaffed, hindi nila kaya as currently set up in their current setup. Would Her Honor agree, or would she like to? Does she have another opinion on this? Because I'm just trying to emphasize that currently, if we stick to the setup, we will not achieve the goal that we have for expediting. We will, to the extent that whatever delays happen at the judiciary level, we will address that. But the delays that happen in the administrative level, we will not be able to address it.
Which is probably why the reason, Mr. President, that since out of the 8,027 or 8,036 children issued CD CLAAS, only 2,269, as the good gentlewoman said, were issued pre-adoption placement authorities. Probably the reason that at the tail end of that process, only 1,243 children were issued decrees of adoption. Additionally, Mr. President, out of that 8,036, just using my number, Mr. President, ang napunta po,
Madam Sponsor, I need to interject because it doesn't follow. 8,000, there were 8,000 children declared legally available. And of the 8,000, the next step was to provide them with a pre-adoption authority. And that was just 2,000. So
para
there's
po
this
yun
gap
sa
of
domestic
5,000.
adoption,
So
the
when you say
gentleman.
only 1,000 eventually got the adoption order, then that means that the judiciary was able to process 50% of them. But what happened to the remaining 5,000 that was left unprocessed in DSWD? That's all I'm trying to point out. The bottleneck is not just with the judiciary. Let's also address the bottleneck in the executive department.
Any bottleneck, Mr. President, good gentlewoman, is important, but it may be smaller than the numbers so far show. So if I may place on the record additional numbers to help us solve the mystery and also moving forward, help us solve the problem better. Of those 8,000, just to use the number I got from DSWD, no? Out of the 8,036, Mr. President, na nakakuha ng CD-CLAA, yung napunta sa intercountry adoption ay 3,486. Yung 2,269 po na sinabi ng good gentlewoman, sila po yung na-match for domestic adoption. And I did also mention earlier, Mr. President, that the final 1,243 who received a decree of adoption, they were domestically adopted. So bukod pa po yung adopted intercountry. So the rest po, according to DSWD, remained available for adoption dahil hindi po na-adopt. The majority of them also have special needs. Kaunti po yung na-match locally, ayon po sa DSWD, kasi kakaunti ang local na potential adoptive parents na nag-a-apply kasi ayon sa kanila, mahal ang judicial phase. So, ang unaccounted for pa po natin, good gentlewoman, Mr. President, out of the 8,036, just to use the number I received, ay 1,881. Sila na lang po yung wala pang PAPA or Pre-Adoption Placement Authority. So yun po, Mr. President, good gentlewoman.
Thank you. We'll reconcile those figures. In the meantime, I had a quick chat with the acting majority floor leader, and I believe we need to suspend and continue anytime next week.
Certainly.
Due to the availability of Her Honor. Anyway, I just want to spread into the record that I really was not going to interpellate yet today, but in the interest of moving it forward so that Her Honor knows what my concerns are, I made a point of preparing for today so that Her Honor can already basically see where I am headed, the concerns that I have, and can get the necessary data or also come up with her proposals based on the concerns I have. So to wrap up, my concerns really are we don't need to even discuss on the on eliminating the judiciary process. I recognize that we are on the same page in removing that facet, and we can put in whatever safeguards. I think we will both do whatever we can think of to put the safeguards there. But what I feel there is still a big gap in is addressing the needs of this the needs of DSWD to be able to fulfill that role that they have, because they have not been able to do that. And just by adding in the same way that we added 35 million, that's not that was really pangtawid. That was really just to start the process. But there's a lot we need to do to strengthen that bureaucracy. And I'll have a few more questions next time, and then after that I will submit it to Her Honor for possible amendments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, good gentlewoman, Mr. President. I appreciate the questions that the good gentlewoman propounds. I will try to come up with some more data to respond even more substantively to her concerns. At gaya po ng sinabi ko kanina, Mr. President, I look forward to positively receiving her proposed amendments at the proper time para lalong pahusayin ang trabaho ng DSWD sa usaping ito, and they too are have expressed their commitment to seeing that through, at lalong-lalo na po, Mr. President, alang-alang sa ating mga bata na sa ngayon ay walang maayos na pag-parenting or pagiging bahagi ng isang pamilya o pagiging anak ng mga magulang, na pwede nating mas bigyang daan sa pamamagitan nitong administrative proceedings at mas mahusay pang DSWD. So maraming salamat, good gentlewoman, at maraming salamat po, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I know there are a lot more questions, and I know that the Senate President himself have few more questions on this bill. So, Mr. President, I move that we suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 1933 under Committee Report number 147.
Any objection? Hearing none, consideration is suspended.
Mr. President, I move that we dispense with the reading of the Journal of the 44th Session, Monday, February 8, 2021, and consider the same as approved.
Any objection? Hearing none, journals are approved.
Mr. President, so I move that we proceed with the additional reference of business.
Yes, okay, I have a bit of a issue here, but you may proceed with the additional reference of business.
Additional reference of business, bill on first reading, Senate number 2048, an act providing for government financial institutions unified initiatives to distressed enterprises for economic recovery guide, introduced by Senator Go.
It says here, and I think the recommendation of the Bills and Index is to refer this to the Committees on Government Corporations as a primary committee and MAX as the secondary referral. But there were two other bills that were filed to this effect. And as a matter of fact, I was one of the authors of the other bill. And it was originally referred to the Committee on Banks. Later on, there was a request from the office of Senator Grace Poe that this be referred to the Committee on Government Corporations. Now, this is now being referred to the Committee on Government Corporations, but I am informed that even the Bills and Index are saying that it should be in the Committee on Banks. They're just proceeding to suggest Committee on Government Corporations only because for consistency. But the way we look at it, it should be referred to the Committee on Banks. So if there are no objections, I refer all these bills to the Committee on Rules so that the Rules Committee can decide on what to do with this finally. All right, so 2048, 1646, and 2003 filed by this representation are all referred to the Committee on Rules for a proper disposal. May proceed.
Right, Mr. President. So the Committee on Rules will resolve that matter.
Mm.
All right.
Resolution, PS Resolution number 645, resolution directing the proper Senate committees to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the issue of counterfeit garments appropriating weave patterns of Filipino indigenous peoples and communities entering the country, introduced by Senator Binay.
To the Committees on Cultural Communities and Trade.
So with that, Mr. President, there are no more matters on hand. Mr. President, I move that we adjourn session until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Monday, Feb 15, 2021. So moved.
Any objection? Chair hears none. The session is adjourned until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Monday, February 15, 2021.
Thank you.